something to hide.
Summer 2004, Columbia, Missouri.
I see trouble. I see trouble.
The University of Missouri is rocked when a student's body is discovered off campus.
My name's Jeff Westbrook. I was an investigator in the Columbia Police Department in Columbia, Missouri.
Jeff Westbrook, Tech 1.
I was actually the first responding investigator. There were some residents in one of the houses, and when they walked out, they saw the body and called 911.
The corpse is naked, save for a pair of boxers. It's clear the throat's been slit.
When the other investigators arrived, we were brainstorming what happened here.
With no clothes or identification, investigators have no way of knowing who the victim is or how he got there.
Tree 20, we're verifying the EDW suspect.
We started knocking on doors. We had a picture just of his face, and we said, "Do you recognize this person? Is it someone that you've ever seen before?" And in talking with someone, we discovered the young man's name was Jesse Valencia.
Jesse was a 23-year-old history major, going into his senior year at Mizzou, the University of Missouri. He was openly gay and a vocal advocate for social justice, who dreamed of becoming a lawyer after leaving his small town of Perryville, Kentucky.
I'm Lupe Valencia, and I'm Jesse's stepfather. It's been 18 years, and I just can't really talk about it. Jesse did not deserve to have what happened to him happen. Well, no one does, but he sure didn't deserve it. Yeah.
Jesse's family and friends were so proud of him, knowing that he came from such humble beginnings.
Jesse grew up in a barn much like this. He loved riding horses. Jesse, he was just full of life, just go, go, go. If you met Jesse, you would love him. Very proud of Jesse.
When Jesse arrived at the University of Missouri in the fall of 2002, he made tons of friends, both on and off campus.
I do remember Jesse. This picture right here. He was just a fun young kid, just out having a good time with his friends, doing cartwheels, dancing his butt off. It's just a random snapshot like we always did, and we happened to get the one of him. Can't see his face, but that's him. He was a great kid.
Jesse was loved. How could anyone want to hurt him? And now with his murder, everyone in Columbia wants this case solved. Everyone wants to know, is there a killer lurking outside the university or on campus? Who is the murderer among them? Turns out Jesse just lived 7 houses down the block from where they found him, in a house that's been converted into apartments. Investigators could tell there'd been a struggle.
My name is Randy Bain, and I'm the former chief of the Columbia Police Department. We did find a neighbor who was in the adjoining apartment who does remember something going on that evening.
My name is Morley Swingle. I was the elected prosecutor of Cape Girardeau County, Missouri. The person that lived next door, Christopher Kepner was his name, and he came home drunk about 3 in the morning. And he said, I went to bed. Sometime during the night, I heard arguing. Christopher Kepner said, I got up and I pounded on the wall and I said, shut up over there. And then it went deathly quiet, and I never heard any more noise.
It seems a fight started in Jesse's apartment and branched out. Because his body was found down the street, his murderer probably chased him. Yet no one on the street heard as much as a whimper. Jesse's apartment offered more clues.
One of the things that we discovered in his apartment was a used condom. And so that was collected for DNA evidence.
Did Jesse hook up with the wrong person? Or did he know his killer? Was this a lover's quarrel that went violently wrong? The sergeant on the scene puts Officer Steven Rios in charge of guarding Jesse's apartment, and medical examiner Valerie Rao has Jesse's body transported to the coroner's office. It's clear from the autopsy that Jesse put up a hell of a fight.
There was heavy bruising across his collarbone area, and there was significant bruising in the middle of his back between his shoulder blades. They also took DNA from Jesse's fingernails. Jesse had a shaved chest, yet they found arm hairs that were not Jesse's lying on his chest.
The medical examiner concludes that the knife used to slice Jesse's throat had a serrated blade. The killer was so brutal, he severed both of Jesse's jugular veins and nicked his vertebrae.
Jesse's throat is slit. That's very personal. It's unusual for that to be a stranger-related homicide. So it's very likely we're looking for a person who knows Jesse.
Little drops of doubt dripping down from my brain and my heart.
John Worley, AB color marker, take 1.
My name is John Worley. I am childhood friends of Jesse. When I heard Jesse was dead, I immediately thought to myself, who did he make mad? Because if he had something he needed to say or a way that he felt, he was gonna say it.
Someone knows something. Someone has a secret. But who?
Won't you show me something?
And then, just hours after the autopsy, investigators get a call. It's about a party a day earlier.
Police, open up.
And an arrest that unlocks a shocking secret that shakes this small town to its core. Within 24 hours of Jesse Valencia's body being found, a college friend of his named Crystal Loyland calls investigators. Crystal informs them that Jesse had attended a party at her house the night before.
I never thought time like that. It's marching on, but I'm standing still.
Crystal Loyland had been hanging out with friends on that last night of Jesse's life, and he had come by. She had said he seemed happy and carefree.
You got me begging for
Jesse was always the life of the party. He loved being the center of attention. He loved being the one generating good times for people.
Jesse showed up with two men Crystal hadn't met before, a guy named Eric Thurston and his roommate, Ed McDevitt. Crystal says Eric left the party around 2:30 in the morning, and Jesse left with Ed around 3 a.m.
So we knew that around 3 a.m. that morning that he was still alive.
Investigators tracked down Ed and Eric, the two people who were last seen with Jesse, and bring them in for questioning.
We had them both in separate interview rooms. Wanted to see what each individually, independently, had to say about their whereabouts that night.
When they brought Eric Thurston in, he gave one of the more interesting interviews that the detectives had ever had, because when they sat him down and told him that Jesse Valencia was dead, his response was, "Well, I could kill a person, but I didn't kill him." That is such a bizarre statement that immediately it ratcheted him up higher on the list of suspects.
Eric also tells investigators that he and Ed used to be together, but had recently broken up. But now, Ed and Jesse are dating.
They looked hard at Eric Thurston because they thought, well, maybe Eric Thurston was jealous because Ed was seeing somebody else.
That somebody else being Jesse Valencia, who appears to have been killed in a crime of passion. Eric tells investigators that after he left Crystal's party, he met a guy named Kevin, and they spent the night together. They're going to need to track down this Kevin and confirm the alibi.
21 verifying the ADW suspect. 21 Roger.
Meanwhile, down the hall, investigators question Ed McDevitt.
When they interviewed Ed McDevitt, Ed was visibly distraught and was just the opposite of Eric Thurston.
He was upset, crying. Ed said that he had met Jesse approximately 2 days prior at a local nightclub.
Just ride with me, go coast to coast if you fly with me. We ain't worried about the hate or the rivalries. We can dance through the night, gon' slide with me, yeah.
Jesse, he was a beautiful person. Guys would notice him, girls would notice him, like everybody was always looking at him.
Ed McDevitt was no different. One look, and they were hooking up that night at Jesse's place.
So tell me where your mind at. If I'm on the price, we can buy that. Got a feeling that you're to me now.
Ed confirms that the condom police recovered from Jesse's apartment was from this first encounter.
And then on Friday night, Ed saw him again at that party.
After Jesse and Ed left Crystal's party together, they chatted on the sidewalk outside her house.
Jesse wanted Ed to come home with him, but Ed said, no, I have to go to work at 6 in the morning. He was a chef. And so Jesse ended up walking home by himself.
Don't let the sun go down.
Ed tells the investigators that when he got home, he went right to bed. And that's his alibi for when they think Jesse was murdered. It's not a strong one.
The knife that cut his neck had a serrated blade. So one thing that worried them about Ed McDevitt was he was a chef who had access to a lot of knives.
Before they release Ed and Eric, investigators ask for and receive DNA samples that might connect them back to the crime. That DNA could break the case wide open, but it'll take several agonizing weeks to get the results. Then, the police receive an anonymous call that turns the investigation on its head.
One of the tips that we get says that Jesse Valencia was having a relationship with a married Columbia police officer at the time of the crime. Whoever called mentioned that this Columbia police officer was married and had a young child.
Making the police department realize we have to look into the possibility that maybe it's one of our own.
We did not have any openly gay male officers. And so it's a police officer who may have that relationship on the side away from his family. We can't discount the fact that it might be someone who just has a beef with the police department and trying to cause a problem. But you don't know that until you follow the lead.
The anonymous tip gains more credibility when investigators bring 21-year-old Andy Schermerhorn in for questioning. Andy is one of Jesse's former boyfriends.
Andy Schermerhorn gave some blockbuster information. He said, I was at Jesse's house on May 14th, and we were in bed together having sexual activity. Around 3:30 in the morning, there was a knock at the door, and Jesse answered the door, and there was a police officer in uniform. Andy Schermerhorn said, I got frightened and I stood up on the bed and I was afraid something terrible was going to happen. And Jesse said, no, it's okay, he's cool. And the police officer took off his gun belt and put it on the cabinet and joined us in bed. After it was over, the police officer looked at Jesse and said, this has got to be a secret, and he did not give his name.
They ask Andy if he might be able to identify the officer if he saw him again.
And Andy Schermerhorn said, I saw him out in the hall. It was that guy we passed in the hall.
The day after Jesse Valencia is found with his throat slit, one of Jesse's former lovers has just stunned detectives. He told them that one of their colleagues, a police officer who he just passed in the hall, had a sexual encounter with him and Jesse.
That was a shocking piece of information. And so we went back, well, who did we walk past? And we walked past an officer by the name of Steven Rios.
It's the same officer that was standing guard over Jesse Valencia's apartment after his body was found.
Steven Rios was a married Columbia police officer. Young, in his 20s, with a brand new child, had only been on our department 2 or 3 years at that time, and by all accounts, doing a great job.
Investigators discover that 7 weeks earlier, Steven Rios had arrested Jesse Valencia.
On April 18th of 2004, 3 of Jesse's friends, all females, were having a party, and the police were called twice for noise violations at that apartment. Jesse Valencia got between the girls and Officer Steve Rios and said, what's your probable cause for arresting my friends?
Rios arrested Jesse and wrote him a ticket to appear in court. The charge, obstructing a governmental operation. When Rios showed up for work on the day of the murder, he didn't hide that he knew the victim.
He said, yes, that's a person I'd arrested 6 weeks earlier for obstructing a governmental operation.
But what alarms investigators is that on the day Jesse was found dead, Rios was assigned to stand guard over Jesse's apartment. Is it possible Rios went inside to tamper with evidence that might expose him as Jesse's lover? Or maybe even as Jesse's killer?
On June 8th, now 3 days after the fact, very odd thing happens. Stephen Rios comes to the police department, goes to the sergeant in charge of the investigation and says, "Hey, Sergeant, I've heard about this tip that you got. You might hear my name, but I want you to know it's not me."
The detective, he'd already talked to Andy Schermerhorn. And so he said to Stephen Rios, "Andy Schermerhorn said on May 14th that you came by in uniform at 3:30 in the morning and joined them for sexual activity." And he said, "Sex?"
Now it appears to be a point you trying to make clear to me, but
Rios eventually admits that he had sex with Jesse 6 times since he had arrested him.
be sincere to me. Honesty and
The last time being a week before he was found dead.
He said, "I didn't tell anybody because I'm married and my wife said she'd leave me if I ever had an affair with anybody.
what I heard about you and hearing from you. And this
We had sex, but no, I didn't kill him and I have no idea who did or what happened to him."
Rios is placed on leave until he can be completely cleared. He cooperates fully with investigators, giving them permission to search his car and his house. They find no evidence that links him to the murder.
Even though Stephen Rios admits to the relationship, doesn't necessarily mean that he's involved in the homicide.
Rios claims he last saw Jesse a week before he was killed, so investigators return their focus to the people who were with Jesse on the very night of his murder.
We did ask Eric Thurston and Ed McDevitt if we could search their apartment. Both of them agreed.
They're looking for bloody clothing or a serrated chef's knife, any evidence that could potentially tie them to Jesse's murder.
We did search and did not find any type of evidence that we thought was related to the crime there.
Investigators are able to track down Kevin, the hookup who was Eric Thurston's alibi for the night of the murder. Kevin tells them that Eric was with him the entire night, so Ed McDevitt's roommate is removed from the suspect list. As for Ed McDevitt, he still has no alibi.
Things were starting to really narrow down. Ed McDevitt was a suspect, along with Stephen Rios.
The police don't want news of the salacious affair to get out, but someone leaks Stephen Rios' name to the media.
Being in the LGBTQIA+ community, I think sometimes we're looked at differently. We're looked at as a bad person, an immoral person, and I think the police were embarrassed by that.
Rios' exposed affair humiliates him in front of family, fellow officers, and his community, and marks the start of a very messy, very public meltdown. It begins when Rios buys a shotgun at Walmart and contacts his colleagues to tell them he's going to kill himself.
They put him in a mental facility for a mental health treatment because they considered him a danger to himself or others.
The next day, we're called by the facility, and they said Stephen Rios has escaped.
320, we're verifying the EW suspect.
134, be advised, very clean, please.
71, roger.
He's standing on a parking garage ledge, threatening to jump off.
Is Rios feeling shame over having the affair? Or guilt over having committed murder? If your deepest, darkest secret, the one you'd do anything to protect, was revealed to the world, how would you react? For Columbia, Missouri police officer Stephen Rios, it's threatening to jump from a 4-story parking garage in full view of TV news cameras.
Stephen Rios threatened to commit suicide, the reaction of a killer, or the cheating husband who knew his life was over.
I was like, come on, you need to be a man and stand up and own what you did and not cower out and do something like that.
I was one of the officers assigned to talk to Stephen on that ledge. And I said, you don't want to do this. Think about your son.
For 2 hours, Rios keeps officers at bay and spectators on edge.
Finally, this field training officer, who was a close friend of his, talked to him, and Stephen came down off that ledge and was subsequently transferred to a more secure mental health facility.
Even with Rios threatening suicide, the police have no probable cause to arrest him for Jesse Valencia's murder. And he's not the only suspect. Ed McDevitt told police he was asleep by himself at the time Jesse was murdered, so he has no alibi. But Rios does.
Rios said, I got off work at 3 o'clock in the morning. I went upstairs and I drank some beer with other officers on the rooftop. And then I drove home.
We talked to his wife, and she goes, yes, he came home between 5:15 and 5:30 a.m. And she remembered that because she'd been up with their baby at that time.
When investigators follow up on Rios' alibi, police dispatcher Leah Wooden tells them she remembers Rios leaving the rooftop at 4:47 in the morning.
We actually had the police officers drive to see how long would it take to go from where Stephen Rios was drinking beer after work to Jesse's house, and then from there to Stephen Rios' home.
The entire drive takes only 7 minutes. If Rios got home between 5:15 and 5:30, like his wife said, that means he had between 20 and 35 minutes of unaccounted for time. But is that a large enough window to chase someone down, kill them, then dispose of any evidence, including a murder weapon?
We were not able to ever recover the murder weapon, but we had several officers say that they remember Stephen Rios carrying a knife similar to the one that we believe was used in the crime.
Ed McDevitt, a chef, also had access to a lot of knives, but Ed's motive is unclear. Then, a week after the murder, Jesse's best friend comes forward with a new and shocking insight.
Joan Sheridan said when Jesse went to court on his first appearance on his case for obstructing governmental personnel, that was May 25th, the case did not get thrown out like he thought for sure it would be.
Jesse was certain that if he was sleeping with the officer who gave him the ticket, he would, of course, pull some strings to get it dropped.
He said, if this case doesn't get thrown out, I've got a little secret the chief of police might want to know. And so that leads you to believe that it was possible that the next time Officer Stephen Rios rode up, Jesse confronted him about, are you married? I have a little secret that the chief of police might want to know. And that confrontation might have led to his throat being cut.
So we have a motive. Jesse Valencia had said that he was going to come to our department and tell me about the relationship with Stephen Rios.
Stephen Rios had given all the power to Jesse Valencia. For Jesse Valencia to ruin him if Jesse wanted to.
The evidence is compelling, but it's all circumstantial. What the police need is some strong physical evidence that links Jesse's murder to one of the prime suspects, Steven Rios or Ed McDevitt. Now, almost a month after Jesse was killed, maybe they'll finally get their answer. The results are back on the DNA collected at Jesse's autopsy. Will they finally prove who killed Jesse Valencia?
To the black water in our veins, they say.
A secret without facts to back it up is just a rumor.
To this life we fight.
Now, the science of DNA testing will reveal the facts behind Jesse Valencia's murder.
One of the most difficult times for us was the period of time where we don't have enough to arrest the suspect, and so we're waiting for the DNA information. In this case, it turned out to actually be very critical evidence.
The condom found in Jesse's apartment has Jesse's and Ed McDevitt's DNA on the inside and outside.
Not surprisingly, it corroborated with what Ed McDevitt had said about the sexual activity that they had had.
But they had also found DNA under Jesse's fingernails. Who did that belong to?
Underneath the fingernails of the dead young man, there was Steven Rios' DNA.
It's common in a physical assault for the DNA of the attacker to end up under the fingernails of the victim.
Rios denied that there was any kind of a physical altercation. And so the fact that there was DNA under the nails turned out to be very critical information.
But there's more. The arm hairs the medical examiner found on Jesse's chest, only 1 in 57 trillion people would match to those hairs. And they match to Steven Rios.
So that was completely damning evidence. The only thing he could not cover was the DNA that he'd left on the body.
I was so angry about it. The last thing I wanted to do was get in front of a camera and say, we have arrested a Columbia police officer for homicide. But that's what we had to do. I said, I want you all to understand that we want this person to be in prison. This person violated everyone's faith.
Hearing that it was a married police officer he was involved with was, like, just couldn't believe it. Anybody who's in a position to where you serve other people, period, would utilize that power to start the relationship and not being open and honest about who he is as well. The whole thing just feels gross to me.
Joan Sheridan had told investigators that the first time Rios showed up at Jesse's apartment, Jesse was seduced by the power of his uniform, badge, and gun. Something Rios was counting on and had done before.
After I had filed the charge against Steven Rios, 3 women came forward who said that Rios had also made inappropriate advances toward them. So it did seem like Rios was using his badge not just on Jesse Valencia for sex, but potentially other people as well.
Steven Rios goes to trial on May 17th, 2005. At this point, there are no secrets left to hide. Along with presenting the evidence, prosecutors want the jury to hear Jesse's own words from beyond the grave.
I went ahead and put Joan Sheridan on the stand so the jury could hear that Jesse had made those comments that the next time he comes over, I'm going to confront him about the fact that my ticket hasn't gone away and that I have a little secret the chief of police might want to know if it doesn't.
Rios takes the stand in his own defense. He tells the jury that while he may be a liar and an adulterer, he is not a murderer. But will the jury believe him?
Anytime a defendant testifies, all you have to have is one jury member believe him, and it would be a hung jury or a not guilty verdict.
After 4 days of viewing evidence and hearing testimony, the jury gets the case. They deliberate for 14 hours before reaching a verdict.
Stephen Rios testified, and the jury did not believe him, and they came back with first-degree murder, which is life without parole, and another 20 years on the armed criminal action. Stephen Rios used his badge for sex, and then he used his knife to shut the mouth of his lover forever.
The day that the verdict was given, it was just a huge sense of relief, knowing that the person who did that is not going to be able to do that to another person.
Would you catch me if I fell?
Every tip and lead investigators received about Stephen Rios came about because Jesse couldn't stop telling his secret. And that's how he brought his killer to justice.
No one was happier than we were. Not only did this person commit a horrible crime, but they violated everyone's trust because they're the person you're supposed to go to for help, and yet they're the person who committed the crime.
Two years later, with Rios in the South Dakota State Penitentiary in Sioux Falls, an appeals court rules that the secrets Jesse told Joan Sheridan were inadmissible in court because they were hearsay. They overturned Stephen Rios' conviction. Prosecutors now have to try Rios a second time without that testimony.
This time, the jury came back with second-degree murder, and they came back with armed criminal action again. Stephen Rios got life in prison for the second-degree murder. The difference is that on first-degree murder, he never would have got out. With second-degree murder, he could conceivably get out as an old man someday.
I came out right after high school at 18, and Jesse followed suit. Our families are so supportive. I believe if Stephen would have had that, I think the outcome would have been completely different. I hope now that while he's in jail, he really thinks about hiding that secret, who he was. And I hope that that is something that's constantly on his heart moving forward, because you can't change who you are.
Jesse's out, loud, and proud spirit is probably doing cartwheels in heaven to know that today, at least in the Columbia Police Department, there are fewer secrets.
For the first time, I had a gay man who is our LGBTQ plus liaison from the police department, who is also our SWAT team commander. That's not something you would have expected even 10 years ago.
It's a small step, but one that would not have been lost on the big-hearted social justice warrior that was Jesse Valencia.
If Jesse was still with us, I think he would have been a really amazing lawyer. He would fight for you. He would do anything he could to protect you. That's how he was.
That's what he would be working on, fighting for the little guy. That's what Jesse would want us to do.
The concept of a sanctuary is inherently fragile, often built upon a foundation of collective denial rather than genuine security. When we look back at the decade of the 1990s, particularly through the lens of rural isolation, we frequently romanticize the era as the twilight of societal innocence. It was a time before the digital age tethered everyone to constant, unyielding surveillance, a period where the boundaries of a community were defined not by sophisticated security systems or cameras, but by the deeply familiar faces of those who lived right next door. In small, insular places, this intense familiarity cultivated a profound and almost dangerous level of absolute trust. The physical and most visible manifestation of this widespread trust was the universally unlocked door. To turn a lock against a neighbor at night was considered not just unnecessary, but fundamentally an insult to the deeply interwoven social fabric of the town. People operated under the powerful assumption that physical proximity equated to shared morality, believing that those who occupied their immediate geographical space inherently shared their respect for human life and communal safety. This was the exact atmospheric paradigm of Lyon. Lyon was much more than just a geographic location on a map. It was a collective state of mind, a quiet rural enclave where the daily rhythms of life were predictable, comforting, and remarkably slow. It was an environment characterized by its heavy peacefulness, a place where the most significant daily disturbances were usually merely the natural elements shifting with the seasons. In a tight-knit community where every single resident knows the lineage, the history, and the mundane daily routines of everyone else, the very concept of a violent predator seems inherently foreign and impossible. The collective consciousness of Lyon held firmly to the comforting belief that profound danger was an external force, a chaotic and distant element that existed only in crowded, anonymous cities or far-off places, never within the borders of their own serene, sunlit landscape. This deeply ingrained sense of total safety created a massive psychological blind spot. When an entire village believes they are surrounded entirely by lifelong friends and harmless acquaintances, the human brain simply stops scanning the perimeter for threats. The villagers of Lyon lived their lives in a state of relaxed vulnerability, entirely unaware that the architecture of their idyllic, peaceful existence was about to be completely and violently dismantled. The horror of what ultimately transpired in Lyon did not announce itself with the dramatic fanfare or loud warnings often depicted in cinematic portrayals of great tragedy. True psychological terror rarely arrives with thunder. Instead, it slips silently through the cracks of the mundane. The incident unfolded on an afternoon that was devastatingly ordinary. It was the kind of afternoon that blends seamlessly into the memory of 1,000 others, characterized by a slow-setting sun and the gentle, ambient noise of rural life echoing across the properties. A young girl was playing just outside her home, occupying the familiar and seemingly impenetrable territory of her own front porch and the adjacent green lawn. This was her ultimate safe zone, an area continuously bathed in the implicit, unquestioned protection of her family and her surrounding community. Various toys were scattered across the grass, serving as the colorful remnants of innocent, carefree childhood games. There was absolutely nothing in the atmosphere to suggest impending doom or unseen danger. The air was perfectly still. The environment was entirely calm. The catastrophic transition from absolute peace to a nightmare of incomprehensible proportions occurred within the thinnest, most silent margin of time. In the tragic choreography of this specific event, the most haunting element is the sheer, suffocating silence of the abduction itself. There were no desperate, echoing cries for help piercing the calm afternoon air. There was no chaotic sound of a physical struggle, no breaking branches, and no sudden, violent commotion to alert the adults situated nearby. In merely a few moments of inevitable, entirely human inattention, a brief turning of the head or a momentary distraction inside the house, the child simply vanished. She evaporated from the physical landscape as completely as a shadow consumed by the fading light. When the adults finally returned their gaze to the yard, they found only the abandoned toys lying incongruously on the peaceful lawn, serving as silent, mocking witnesses to a crime that left absolutely no immediate physical trace or clue. The sudden, inexplicable absence of the child was a jarring void, a severe rupture in reality that the human mind initially struggles to process or accept. The village of Lyon, within a matter of minutes, was plunged into a suffocating, breathless silence. The quietness of the town, which was once a proud symbol of its tranquility, instantly transformed into an oppressive, heavy blanket of paralyzing dread. As the sun fully dipped below the horizon and the initial hours began to stretch agonizingly into days, the fundamental nature of the village changed entirely. The peaceful sanctuary rapidly became a desperate landscape of frantic, unyielding searching. The desperate hope of finding a lost child mobilized the entire community, driving them into the surrounding geography with a frantic energy born of pure, unadulterated terror. The trajectory of the search inevitably led them away from the manicured lawns and familiar, safe streets, pushing them relentlessly toward the dense, overgrown forest that heavily bordered the village outskirts. This specific forest, a sprawling expanse of thick vegetation and dark, twisting, confusing pathways, stood in stark contrast to the open, sunlit spaces of the residential town. In the deep pitch black of the night, these woods became a vast theater of desperation. Countless beams of light from heavy flashlights sliced erratically through the oppressive darkness, catching the rough bark of ancient trees and the tangled, unforgiving underbrush. The beams moved frantically and erratically, reflecting the rising, uncontrollable panic of the search parties as they combed through the wilderness. The forest was vast, unyielding, and seemingly designed by nature to swallow secrets whole. The passage of time in any missing child case is a brutal, blunt instrument of psychological torture. Days slowly blurred into one another, with each new sunrise bringing a renewed, fragile sense of agonizing hope, and each subsequent sunset confirming yet another day of devastating failure. The emotional and psychological toll on the community of Leon was immeasurable as the search stretched on. Yet, the final culmination of this desperate, exhausting search would prove to be far worse than the agonizing uncertainty that preceded it. Deep within the tangled, dark, unforgiving heart of that dense rural forest, the final remnants of communal hope were violently extinguished. The discovery eventually made by the exhausted search teams was not merely tragic. It was a scene of such profound depravity that it utterly defied the limits of human comprehension. The fragile body of the young girl was finally located among the trees, but the horrific condition in which she was found instantly shattered any lingering illusions the town held about the sanctity of life. The remains were not intact, revealing a level of brutality and physical destruction that challenged the very boundaries of human cruelty. It was a stark, visual confirmation of an evil so absolute and uncompromising that it seemed entirely impossible it could exist in their quiet world. However, the defining element of this profound tragedy, the core aspect that permanently elevated the event from a horrific, bloody murder to a generational psychological nightmare, was not the geography of the crime or even the gruesome, unspeakable nature of the final discovery. The true terror, the detail that would mentally break the village of Leon, lay entirely in the identity of the architect of this suffering. The predator who had carefully stalked, silently abducted, and brutally extinguished the life of this innocent child was not a transient drifter passing through the night on a forgotten highway. He was not a faceless, unknown stranger who had crept into Leon under the absolute cover of darkness to inflict pain and then vanish. The monster did not hide in the shadows of the unknown. He lived squarely in the bright light of day. He was a neighbor. He was a deeply familiar face, a man who regularly walked the exact same streets, breathed the exact same air, and likely exchanged polite, meaningless pleasantries with the very family he would eventually and methodically destroy. This particular man harbored a dark, severely twisted psychological landscape, a violent internal reality full of predatory urges that the community had either collectively failed to recognize or had willfully, comfortably ignored over the years. He deliberately weaponized the foundational trust of the entire village. He recognized the relaxed vulnerability of his environment and ruthlessly exploited it with cold, calculating precision. Using his unquestioned status as a known entity, he easily bypassed the natural, instinctual defenses of both the child and the surrounding community. After committing an act of unspeakable sexual violence and forcibly taking the life of an innocent in the woods, he did not flee in a panic into the wilderness to escape justice. He simply walked back to his own house. He calmly crossed the threshold of his home, closed his front door, and seamlessly resumed his normal life, as though the moral fabric of the universe had not just been violently torn apart by his own hands. This singular, terrifying fact is exactly what haunts the collective memory of Leon to this day. The realization that they had unknowingly lived alongside a ruthless predator, that they had unknowingly harbored a violent, active threat within their most intimate inner sanctum, fundamentally and permanently altered their perception of reality. It forced every single resident to confront the terrifying truth that the ability to commit horrific acts of violence is not necessarily accompanied by obvious, monstrous physical traits or clear outward warning signs. The case of the missing and murdered girl in the 90s is not simply a closed, forgotten file resting in a dusty police archive. It remains an enduring, cold warning about the dangerous illusion of absolute safety and the highly perilous nature of assumed, unearned trust. It serves as a perpetual, chilling reminder that the most dangerous entities in our lives do not always break down our locked doors. Sometimes, we willingly hold the doors open for them, completely unaware that the monster we so deeply fear in the dark is the very same person we smile and greet in the warm sunlight. To understand the gravity of the events that unfolded in Leon during that fateful decade, one must first strip away the modern sensibilities of the 21st century and inhabit the specific, localized reality of a 1990s rural community. This was an era defined by a different kind of silence, a period before the persistent hum of digital connectivity began to vibrate in every pocket and corner of our lives. In Leon, the passage of time was marked not by the rapid-fire updates of a news cycle, but by the shifting shadows on the stone walls of the village and the seasonal changes in the surrounding thickets. The setting was one of profound, almost ancient isolation, where the geography itself acted as a protective barrier against the perceived chaos of the outside world. To the residents of Leon, the village was a closed loop, a self-contained universe where every face was a familiar map of shared history and every doorstep was a gateway to a trusted neighbor's hearth. This environment fostered a psychological state of total immersion in the community, creating a collective identity that prioritized the group's perceived safety above the individual's need for caution. The young girl at the center of this tragedy was the very embodiment of this communal trust and the vibrant, unassuming life force that Leon sought to protect. In the sparse data of the official records, she is often described through the lens of her innocence, a child of her time who existed in a world where play was an outdoor, tactile experience. She was part of the very rhythm of the village, a constant, flickering presence in the lanes and on the porches that defined the residential heart of the town. Her life was composed of the simple, unhurried routines that characterized childhood in the 90s, the freedom to wander within sight of home, the companionship of local peers, and the inherent belief that the adults around her were universal guardians. She was not a child who had been taught to fear the shadows, because in Leon, the shadows were supposed to be harmless. Her daily existence was a testament to a world that no longer exists, a world where a child's laughter was the background noise of a peaceful afternoon, and where the boundaries of her world were as secure as the iron fences and wooden gates that lined the properties. The physical landscape of Leon contributed significantly to this false sense of impenetrable security. The village was characterized by its intimacy, with houses clustered in a way that suggested constant, mutual observation. From any given window, one could see the movements of their neighbors, the hanging of laundry, the tending of gardens, and the playing of children. This architectural closeness created a pervasive illusion of a neighborhood watch that didn't need a name or a badge. It was simply the way of life. When the young girl went out to play on that specific afternoon, she was entering a space that was considered an extension of her own living room. The porch and the yard were not just patches of land. They were sanctified zones of safety. The village's layout, with its narrow paths and shared communal areas, reinforced the idea that no one could ever truly be alone or unobserved. Yet, it was precisely this feeling of being constantly watched by friends that allowed a predator to operate with such devastating efficiency. The community's gaze was focused outward, looking for external threats, while the internal threat remained perfectly camouflaged by the mundane details of everyday life. The cultural context of the 1990s further complicated the village's ability to perceive the rising danger. This was a time when the concept of stranger danger was beginning to permeate the global consciousness, fueled by high-profile cases in distant cities, but in places like Lyon, these warnings felt like dispatches from a different planet. The villagers viewed such horrors as urban phenomena, the result of societal decay in places they would never visit. They believed that their rural isolation and their strong, traditional values served as an invisible shield. This belief created a dangerous hierarchy of trust, where a stranger was viewed with immediate suspicion, but a neighbor was granted an almost divine benefit of the doubt. The social fabric was woven so tightly that to accuse someone within the circle was to threaten the integrity of the entire community. This psychological rigidity meant that even when subtle anomalies in behavior occurred, oddities in the way a man might linger at a fence or a strange intensity in a neighbor's gaze, they were often dismissed as mere eccentricities or private struggles that were none of the community's business. Within this atmosphere, the young girl flourished in her final days, a symbol of the very peace the adults cherished. Her presence was a reminder of why they lived in Lyon, why they tolerated the slow pace and the isolation. She was the future of the village, a child whose safety was the silent contract everyone signed by living there. The toys she left on the grass on that final afternoon were not just plastic and wood. They were the artifacts of a childhood that assumed the world was a benevolent place. When we look at the context of her life, we see a child who is deeply integrated into her family and her surroundings, someone whose absence would not just be a loss but a fundamental tear in the reality of the town. Her identity was inextricably linked to the geography of Lyon, to the specific trees she climbed, the specific porches she sat on, and the specific people who waved to her as they passed. She was the heartbeat of a home that felt invincible until the very moment it was proven to be heartbreakingly fragile. The transition from this idyllic state to the onset of the nightmare was not marked by a sudden storm or a change in the light. It happened during the golden hour of a typical afternoon, a time when the village usually began its gentle descent into the evening routine. The air was likely filled with the mundane sounds of Lyon, the clatter of dinner preparations, the distant barking of a dog, the rustle of the wind through the ram-wrapped forest that stood like a silent sentinel at the edge of the properties. The girl was playing in that liminal space between the house and the world, a territory that felt safe because of its proximity to the familiar. The sheer ordinariness of the moment is what makes the subsequent disappearance so difficult to process. There was no scream to alert the parents, no sound of a car speeding away, no witness to the moment the child's trajectory was violently diverted. This silence was not a lack of sound, but a void where an intervention should have been. It was the sound of a community's trust being turned against itself, as the predator used the very quietness of the village to mask his movements. As the realization began to dawn on her family that the girl was no longer in her usual spot, the initial reaction was likely one of confusion rather than terror. In a place like Lyon, the first assumption is always that a child has wandered to a friend's house or is hiding in a familiar nook. The search started as a domestic one, a series of calls echoing through the house and the yard. But as the minutes ticked by and the calls remained unanswered, the silence of the village began to take on a more sinister quality. The transition from a worried parent to a panicked community happened with the speed of a wildfire. The setting of the 1990s meant that communication was a matter of physical movement. People ran from door to door, the news of the missing child spreading through word of mouth and frantic knocks. The village, which had always felt like a warm embrace, suddenly began to feel like a maze of potential hiding places and terrifying possibilities. The forest that bordered Lyon, which had always been a backdrop to their lives, suddenly transformed in the collective imagination. To the children, it was a place of mystery and adventure, but to the adults in that moment of crisis, it became a dark, impenetrable maw. The ram-wrapped vegetation, which provided the village with its sense of privacy and seclusion, was now a barrier to the truth. The geography of the woods, with its uneven terrain and thick canopy, represented everything the village could not control. As the search parties began to form, the contrast between the sunlit, orderly streets of the town and the chaotic, shadow-drenched interior of the forest became a physical manifestation of the psychological shift occurring in the village. They were moving from the known into the unknown, from a world of neighbors into a world of monsters. In this second phase of our journey into the Leone case, we must acknowledge that the tragedy was not just the act of violence itself, but the total destruction of the context in which these people lived. The young girl was the primary victim, but the victimhood extended to the very concept of the village. The profile of the victim is the profile of an entire way of life that was predicated on the goodness of the man next door. By targeting a child who was playing within the supposed safety of her own home, the perpetrator did more than take a life. He poisoned the soil of the community. He took the specific vulnerabilities of a 1990s rural setting, the lack of surveillance, the total trust, the isolation, and turned them into the instruments of his crime. The context of Leone was one of beautiful, tragic naivety, a place where the doors were left unlocked because no one could imagine the horror that was already sitting in the house next to them, watching and waiting for the sun to hit the perfect angle on the porch. The story of the girl in Leone is the story of the end of an era, the moment when a village realized that the most terrifying thing in the world isn't the stranger in the woods, but the neighbor who knows your name. The anatomy of a tragedy in a place like Leone does not begin with a sudden, explosive rupture of the social order, but rather with a seamless continuation of the mundane. The afternoon of the incident unfolded with a deceptive stillness, characterized by the heavy, golden light that typified the late hours of a rural 1990s day. There was a specific quality to the air during these hours, a quiet settling of dust, and a slowing of the communal pulse as the village transitioned from the labor of the day toward the rest of the evening. The physical environment was a tapestry of domestic tranquility. Houses sat relatively close to one another, separated not by imposing walls or aggressive security perimeters, but by low fences and shared patches of green grass. This architectural intimacy was the physical manifestation of the village's psychological state. To the residents, the spaces between their homes were not voids of vulnerability, but interconnected webs of mutual surveillance and unspoken protection. When the young child stepped out onto her front lawn to play, she was stepping into an arena that every adult in Leone considered absolutely impenetrable. She was enveloped in a profound, collective assumption of safety. The psychological horror of this specific event is rooted entirely in the sheer invisibility of the threat. The predator did not emerge from the dense, dark woods that bordered the town, nor did he arrive in a strange vehicle that would have instantly triggered the inherent suspicions of a closed community. The danger was already situated comfortably within the perimeter. The perpetrator was a neighbor, a man who possessed a deep, terrifyingly accurate understanding of the village's rhythms and blind spots. He knew precisely when the streets were emptiest, when the adults were most deeply engrossed in their evening preparations, and, most importantly, he knew the exact layout of the psychological defenses of his neighbors. His presence on his own property, or on the street, or near the child's yard, would not have registered as an anomaly. To any casual observer, a glance out of a kitchen window would have simply revealed two familiar elements of the Leone landscape, a child playing on the grass and a neighbor existing in his own space. This is the precise mechanism by which the tragedy was engineered. The predator weaponized his own banality, using his status as a known entity to completely bypass the natural alarms that would typically protect a child from harm. The exact moment of the abduction is defined not by what happened, but by what fundamentally did not happen. In the collective imagination, a kidnapping is often visualized as a frantic, violent struggle, characterized by muffled screams, the tearing of fabric, and the chaotic sounds of resistance. However, the reality of the Leone incident was characterized by a sickening, suffocating silence. The child was in her designated safe zone, surrounded by her toys, existing in a state of relaxed play. The distance between safety and catastrophe was remarkably short, requiring only a matter of seconds. It only took a momentary diversion of attention from the adults inside the house, a brief span of time where a mother might turn her back to stir a pot on the stove, or a father might look down to read a headline in the local paper. Within that microscopic window of vulnerability, the neighbor made his move. Because he was a familiar face, a figure the child had likely been taught to greet with a polite smile, there was no immediate instinct to flee or to cry out for help. He did not need to physically overpower her with dramatic force in the open light of day. He merely needed to close the physical distance between them using the devastating leverage of trust. The terrifying efficiency of the act left no physical disruption in the environment. There were no drag marks on the meticulously kept lawn, no broken branches on the ornamental bushes, and no scattered belongings indicating a sudden panic. The child simply evaporated from the visual field of the neighborhood. The toys she had been playing with remained exactly where she had placed them, resting in the grass like silent, colorful monuments to a life that had been abruptly and violently paused. This lack of physical evidence is the very core of the psychological terror that would soon paralyze the village. When violence leaves a mark, it provides the human mind with a starting point, a tangible reality to process and react against. But when a child vanishes into thin air, leaving behind a perfectly undisturbed scene, it creates a cognitive dissonance that is almost impossible to immediately bridge. The mind vigorously rejects the concept of a silent, invisible monster, desperately searching for rational, benign explanations to fill the sudden, gaping void in reality. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting elongated, distorted shadows across the yards of Lyon, the first ripples of realization began to move through the child's home. The initial response was not panic, but a mild, rising irritation mixed with the mundane routines of parenting. A voice called out from the doorway, a standard summons for dinner that was expected to be met with the immediate sound of running footsteps and a breathless apology for losing track of time. When the call was met only by the rustling of leaves and the distant, uncaring chirping of insects, the atmosphere in the house shifted subtly. The parents stepped out onto the porch, their eyes scanning the immediate vicinity, instinctively expecting to see the child hiding behind a tree or emerging from a neighbor's yard. The sight of the abandoned toys, sitting completely still in the fading light, served as the first physical anchor of dread. The toys were a clear indicator that the child's play had been interrupted, but the absolute stillness of the neighborhood provided no clues as to why. The transition from localized concern to absolute, visceral terror happened with agonizing slowness, a creeping coldness that slowly suffocated the family's ability to reason. The search expanded outward from the porch in concentric circles of increasing desperation. The parents moved through their house, checking rooms, calling the child's name with a voice that was steadily losing its composure, the pitch rising with every unanswered plea. They moved into the backyard, checking behind sheds and under the porch, their movements becoming more erratic, their breathing growing shallower. They then crossed the invisible boundary of their property line, moving into the yards of their immediate neighbors, their knocks on front doors sharp and demanding. With every neighbor who opened their door, shaking their head in confusion and denying any knowledge of the child's whereabouts, the parameters of the nightmare expanded. The village of Lyon, previously a source of immense comfort, suddenly transformed into a vast, terrifyingly empty space where a child could simply cease to exist. The community's response was immediate and visceral, reflecting the tight-knit nature of rural life in the 90s. As word spread from house to house, driven by frantic conversations on porches and the urgent ringing of landline telephones, the residents of Lyon poured out of their homes. Suppers were left burning on stoves, televisions were left glowing in empty living rooms, and the collective focus of an entire village narrowed to a single, terrifying objective. People congregated in the streets, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and an emerging, profound fear. The air, which only an hour ago had been filled with the peaceful sounds of a closing day, was now thick with anxious murmurs, sharp questions, and the increasingly desperate shouting of the child's name into the gathering twilight. The village mobilized instinctively, forming small, uncoordinated search parties that began to systematically scour the residential streets, checking alleys, abandoned vehicles, and any conceivable hiding spot within the immediate geography of the town. However, beneath the surface of this frantic communal action, the The true horror of the situation was already silently unfolding. As the villagers ran past one another, sharing panic theories and coordinating their search grids, the predator was among them. The neighbor, the architect of this entire catastrophe, was not fleeing the jurisdiction or hiding in the dense woods. He was physically present within the chaos he had created. He observed the rising panic, watched the desperate parents weeping on their front lawn, and listened to the increasingly frantic calls echoing through the streets. He likely stood on his own porch, or perhaps even joined one of the initial search parties, perfectly blending into the collective trauma of the village. His ability to witness the devastation firsthand, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people whose world he had just destroyed, without betraying a single emotion or offering a shred of confession, elevates the crime from a simple act of violence to a profound manifestation of evil. He was a spectator to his own atrocity, safely insulated by the absolute, unquestioning trust of the people he was deceiving. The descent of the sun marked a critical psychological threshold for the village of Leon. As daylight completely faded, replaced by the deep, uncompromising darkness of a rural night, the nature of the search fundamentally changed. The comforting familiarity of the streets vanished, replaced by harsh shadows cast by street lamps and sweeping beams of heavy flashlights. The boundary between the safe residential area and the dense, intimidating forest at the edge of town became the focal point of the community's terror. The forest, previously an ignored backdrop, now loomed like a massive, impenetrable wall of secrets. The realization that the child was not simply lost in the neighborhood, but was potentially somewhere in that dark, sprawling wilderness, hit the searchers with the force of a physical blow. The silence of the woods stood in stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the search parties, a vast, indifferent expanse that offered no answers and no comfort. The villagers stood at the edge of the tree line, shining their lights into the dense underbrush, shouting a name that was swallowed whole by the darkness, entirely unaware that the answer they were so desperately seeking was not hidden in the wilderness, but was resting quietly behind a locked door in one of the seemingly innocent homes they had left behind. The first night of the incident solidified the trauma into the bedrock of the community. As the hours dragged on, the initial burst of adrenaline gave way to a deep, exhausting dread. The temperature dropped, adding a physical bite to the emotional agony. The parents were trapped in a state of psychological purgatory, unable to accept the reality of the situation, yet forced to endure every agonizing second of the ongoing nightmare. Their home became the epicenter of the crisis, filled with law enforcement officials who had finally arrived from neighboring jurisdictions, their serious faces and clinical questions introducing a cold, sterile reality into the warmth of the family home. The living room, previously a space of comfort and security, was transformed into an impromptu command center, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and paralyzing fear. Every time the phone rang, or a heavy footstep approached the front porch, the collective breath of the room was held, waiting for news that they desperately hoped for, yet simultaneously terrified to receive. Out in the darkness, the village of Leon was forever changed. The concept of the unlocked door, the symbol of their absolute trust in one another, was dead. Though they had not yet discovered the horrifying truth about the neighbor, the sheer fact that a child could vanish without a trace from her own front yard was enough to shatter the illusion of safety. The villagers who continued to search through the night, their flashlights cutting through the fog, were not just looking for a missing girl. They were desperately trying to find a way back to the world they had known only a few hours prior. They were trying to piece together a reality that had been fundamentally broken by an unseen hand. The predator, safe within the walls of his own home, slept while the village burned with anxiety. He had successfully executed a crime of proximity, exploiting the very foundation of the community to commit an act of unspeakable cruelty. The incident was no longer just a missing person case, it was a psychological siege, and the village of Leon was completely unaware that the enemy was already inside the gates, waiting patiently for the dawn. The transition from a frantic community search to a professional, clinical criminal investigation marks the moment when a private tragedy becomes a permanent public scar. In the early hours of the morning following the disappearance, the atmosphere in Lyon shifted from one of urgent adrenaline to a cold, suffocating dread. The local authorities, initially overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis, were soon joined by regional investigators and forensic specialists whose arrival signaled a grim acknowledgement that this was no longer a simple case of a child wandering off. The arrival of these outsiders, with their sterile equipment, yellow tape, and attached, methodical questions, acted as a harsh intrusion into the village's insular world. The yellow tape, in particular, became a physical manifestation of the rupture in Lyon's social fabric, cordoning off yards and lanes that had, for generations, been open and shared. The investigators began the painstaking process of retracing every possible movement the child could have made, but the lack of a clear point of departure, no witnesses, no struggle, no sound, created a vacuum of evidence that seemed to swallow their efforts whole. The search grid eventually pushed past the residential borders and deep into the dense, dark forest that loomed at the edge of the town. This was not a forest of light and clear paths. It was a sprawling, ram-wrap expanse of ancient trees, thick underbrush, and shadows that seemed to hold their breath. For days, the woods were filled with the sound of snapping branches and the rhythmic calling of the child's name, voices that grew hoarse and desperate as time wore on. It was on the fourth day that the search came to a devastating, final halt. Deep within a particularly secluded thicket, far from any of the informal trails used by the village children, a member of the search team stumbled upon a scene that would forever haunt the collective memory of Lyon. The discovery of the young girl's body was not the relief of an ending, but the beginning of a deeper, more profound horror. The remains were found in a state of horrific incompleteness, a detail that suggested a level of focused, ritualistic brutality that the village had never even conceived of in their darkest nightmares. The crime scene itself was a nightmare of psychological and physical violation. Forensic experts moved through the area with a clinical precision that stood in stark contrast to the visceral grief of the community waiting at the forest's edge. The preliminary examination revealed that the child had been subjected to a violent sexual assault before her life was extinguished. The sheer savagery of the act, combined with the perpetrator's attempt to disfigure or dismantle the remains, suggested a motive that went beyond simple opportunistic violence. This was the work of someone driven by a deep-seated, pathological compulsion, a psychological instability that had found a horrific outlet in the innocence of a child. As the medical examiner's team carefully removed the remains, the woods of Lyon were transformed from a place of nature into a cathedral of trauma. The silence that followed the discovery was more oppressive than the shouting that had preceded it. It was the silence of a community realizing that the world they thought they lived in had been a lie. Back in the village, the investigation began to pivot with a new, sharper focus. The initial theory of a transient predator, a drifter passing through on the nearby highway, began to crumble under the weight of the geographic evidence. The location where the body was found was so deeply hidden, so difficult to access for someone unfamiliar with the terrain, that it pointed toward a perpetrator with intimate knowledge of the area. This realization sent a cold shiver through the investigative team. If the killer was not a stranger, he was a resident. The investigation turned inward, and the village of Lyon was suddenly subjected to a level of scrutiny that felt like a betrayal. Police officers began the grueling process of conducting door-to-door interviews, not as seekers of information this time, but as seekers of suspects. Every man in the village was now a potential monster. They looked for scratches on hands, for inconsistencies in alibis, for any hint of nervousness that betrayed a guilty conscience. The once warm greetings between neighbors were replaced by suspicious glances and the heavy, unspoken question of who among them could be capable of such depravity. The twist in the investigation did not come from a sudden forensic breakthrough or a dramatic confession. Instead, it emerged from the slow, agonizing accumulation of behavioral anomalies. Investigators began to look closer at a neighbor whose property was situated in close proximity to the child's home. This individual had been a fixture of the community for years, a man who was often described as quiet or different, but never as dangerous. He was the kind of person who existed on the periphery of social circles, someone the village had collectively decided was harmlessly eccentric. However, as detectives dug deeper into his history, a more disturbing picture began to emerge. There were records of psychological issues, of periods of instability that had been managed or masked by the isolation of rural life. More importantly, witnesses began to recall small, seemingly insignificant details from the days of the search, how he had stood on his porch watching the frantic parents with a strange, detached intensity, or how he had joined the search parties but seemed to steer people away from the specific area of the woods where the body was eventually found. The psychological profile of the neighbor began to align with the forensic evidence in a terrifying way. The brutality of the crime and the treatment of the remains suggested a perpetrator who felt a profound need for control and a deep-seated resentment toward the social order he inhabited. By taking a child from the very heart of the village and depositing her in the woods he knew so well, he was essentially playing a game with the community's trust. The investigation focused on his movements on the afternoon of the disappearance. While he claimed to have been home alone, there were no witnesses to verify his whereabouts during the critical window of time when the girl vanished. The detectives noted that his house provided a direct, unobstructed view of the girl's yard, allowing him to monitor her movements and wait for the perfect, silent moment to strike. The mundane nature of his life was his greatest weapon. He was so familiar that he had become invisible. The breaking point arrived when investigators obtained a warrant to search the neighbor's property. This was the moment the village held its breath. As the police moved through his home, they were not looking for the obvious signs of a struggle, but for the hidden remnants of a secret life. In the basement and the outbuildings, they found evidence that shattered the man's facade of harmless eccentricity. There were items that belonged to the girl, small, tragic trophies of his crime that he had kept as a way to prolong the power he felt during the act. But even more chilling than the physical evidence was the discovery of his preoccupation with the investigation itself. He had kept meticulous notes on the search efforts, tracking the movements of the police and the search parties with the precision of a military strategist. He had been a spectator to the agony he had caused, deriving a twisted sense of satisfaction from watching the village unravel from within. The interrogation that followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The neighbor, initially calm and dismissive, began to crack as the weight of the evidence was laid out before him. He spoke not with remorse, but with a disturbing clinical detachment, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the murder of a child. He revealed a worldview characterized by a profound lack of empathy and a desire to break the peace of Lyon. He viewed the village's trust as a weakness, a flaw in the system that he was destined to exploit. His psychological instability was not a defense, but the very engine of his cruelty. He described the moment of the abduction with a chilling lack of drama, confirming what the investigators had feared, that it had been a silent, easy act facilitated entirely by the child's belief that a neighbor was someone to be trusted. He had lured her away with a simple request for help, a standard communal interaction that ended in a nightmare. As the news of his arrest and the details of his confession leaked out to the village, the reaction was not one of closure, but of a total, systemic collapse of trust. The realization that the killer had been standing among them, perhaps even offering words of comfort to the grieving family, was a psychological blow from which Lyon would never truly recover. The investigation had successfully identified the perpetrator, but in doing so, it had exposed a vulnerability that could never be patched. The town realized that their safety had been an illusion maintained by their own refusal to see the darkness in their midst. The neighbor was not a monster from a distant land. He was a product of their own environment, a man who had been shaped and shielded by the very community he destroyed. The files of the investigation were eventually closed, but the questions they raised about the nature of evil and the fragility of trust remained open, echoing through the empty lanes and the dark, unyielding woods of Lyon. The investigation had mapped the crime, but it could not map the way back to the innocence the village had lost. The transition from the investigative phase to the formal theater of justice marked a secondary trauma for the village of Lyon, a period where the intimate, whispered fears of the community were dragged into the sterile, unyielding light of a courtroom. When the trial of the neighbor finally commenced, The geography of the tragedy shifted from the dense, dark woods and the quiet porches of rural Lyon to the cold, echoing halls of the provincial courthouse. This was a place where the chaotic, visceral emotions of a grieving village were forced into the rigid, clinical structures of the legal system. For the residents of Lyon who made the journey to attend the proceedings, the courthouse felt like an alien environment, a space where their lived reality was dissected into exhibits, transcripts, and evidence bags. The air in the courtroom was thick with a different kind of tension than they had experienced in the woods. It was a tension of procedure, of waiting, and of the unbearable proximity to the man who had shattered their world. The defendant sat at the wooden table with a posture that was devastating in its normalcy. In the eyes of the law, he was a man entitled to a defense, but to the people sitting in the gallery, he was a walking ghost of their own failure to perceive evil. He did not look like the monster described in the autopsy reports. He wore a simple, ill-fitting suit that seemed to emphasize his banality, his thinning hair and slumped shoulders, making him look like any other man one might encounter at a local market or a community gathering. This was the most difficult aspect for the witnesses to reconcile, the lack of a visible, outward mark of his depravity. He remained largely impassive, his gaze fixed on the table or the floor, rarely looking at the family of the child or the former neighbors who were now testifying against him. This psychological detachment, which had served him so well during the abduction and the subsequent search, was now his primary shield in the courtroom. He was there physically, but emotionally, he seemed to be inhabiting a different plane of existence, one where the lives he destroyed were merely abstract data points in a legal ledger. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of agonizingly precise details, a methodical reconstruction of the betrayal of trust. They began by establishing the neighbor's intimate knowledge of the village's vulnerabilities, portraying him not as a man who had a sudden lapse in judgment, but as a predator who had carefully curated his environment for the purpose of violence. The prosecution presented the evidence found during the search of his home, the notebooks where he had recorded the movements of the local children and the small, tragic items taken from the victim that he had hidden away in his basement. These items, when held up before the jury, were no longer just toys or scraps of fabric. They were the physical evidence of a predatory fixation that had existed right under the noses of the community. The prosecutor spoke of the calculated nature of the abduction, emphasizing that the lack of noise and the lack of struggle were not signs of a lack of violence, but signs of a terrifyingly successful deception. He had used his identity as a neighbor to lure the child into a space where her screams would be swallowed by the very woods he had spent years studying. The most harrowing portion of the trial involved the presentation of the forensic evidence, a moment that forced the village to confront the absolute limits of human cruelty. When the medical examiner took the stand, the courtroom fell into a silence, so profound it felt like a physical weight. The details of the child's final moments were presented with a clinical detachment that somehow made the horror more visceral. The description of the body, found in a state of incompleteness in the ram wrap underbrush, was a detail that many in the gallery could not endure. It revealed a level of post-mortem violence that spoke to a profound psychological instability, a desire not just to kill, but to deconstruct the very humanity of the victim. The prosecution argued that this was the work of a man who viewed other people as objects for his own gratification and eventual destruction. They mapped out the injuries with a cold precision, linking the physical trauma to the man sitting just a few feet away. For the parents of the girl, sitting in the front row, this was a trial of endurance, as they were forced to hear the most private, horrific details of their daughter's death transformed into public record. In response, the defense team attempted to navigate the narrow and difficult path of psychological mitigation. They did not attempt to deny the physical evidence, which was overwhelming, but instead focused on the neighbor's history of mental health issues. They presented a narrative of a man who was a victim of his own fractured psyche, arguing that his actions were the result of a long-standing, untreated psychological instability that had finally reached a catastrophic breaking point. They called experts to testify about the nature of his compulsions and the way his isolation in Lyon had allowed his darkest impulses to fester without intervention. The defense sought to frame the murder not as an act of calculated evil, but as a tragic symptom of a diseased mind. They portrayed him as a man who was incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions, a person who lived in a blurred reality where the lines between fantasy and violence had long since dissolved. This strategy was an attempt to shift the jury's focus from the victim to the defendant's internal state, asking for a verdict of diminished responsibility that would lead to a mental institution rather than a prison cell. However, the prosecution countered this narrative with the evidence of his own meticulous planning. They pointed to the notes he had kept during the police investigation, the way he had intentionally misled the search parties, and the calm, deliberate way he had returned to his normal life after the crime. This, they argued, was not the behavior of a man lost in a psychotic break. It was the behavior of a highly functional, highly aware individual who knew exactly what he was doing and took specific steps to avoid detection. They argued that his psychological issues did not excuse his choices. Rather, they provided the motive for a crime that was executed with chilling competence. The prosecutor emphasized that the neighbor had chosen to target a child who trusted him, chosen a location that only he knew well, and chosen to watch the community's suffering with a clear and conscious mind. The legal battle became a philosophical one. Was he a man who was mad or a man who was bad? In the context of Leon, where the consequences of his actions were so visible and so permanent, the distinction felt almost insulting. The testimony of the villagers who had participated in the search added a layer of communal grief to the proceedings. One by one, they took the stand and described the 4 days of desperation in the woods, the way they had shouted the girl's name until their voices failed, and the way they had looked to the defendant for support during the crisis. Their testimony was a record of a double betrayal, the murder of a child and the destruction of their collective sense of security. They spoke of the defendant's presence in the search parties, his quiet suggestions on where to look, and his calm demeanor as he stood among them. This revelation of his performative empathy was perhaps the most damaging evidence against him in the eyes of the jury. It showed a man who was capable of profound deception, someone who could mimic the emotions of a grieving community while secretly harboring the knowledge of where the body was hidden. The trial was exposing a level of sociopathy that defied the defense's attempt to categorize him as merely a victim of mental illness. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The defense made a final, desperate plea for compassion, asking the jury to see the defendant as a broken human being in need of medical help. They spoke of the tragedy as a systemic failure, a case where a man's mental health had been ignored until it was too late. But the prosecution's closing was a blistering indictment of the defendant's character and his choices. They returned again and again to the image of the child playing on her lawn, the symbol of the innocence that the defendant had so ruthlessly exploited. They reminded the jury that the laws of the land were designed to protect the vulnerable from the predatory, and that the only just outcome was a total and complete accountability. They asked the jury to consider the psychological horror that would remain in Leon forever if the man who committed this act was not held to the highest standard of the law. The prosecutor ended by speaking the name of the victim, a final attempt to center the trial on the life that had been taken rather than the man who had taken it. The jury's deliberation was a period of agonizing suspense for the village. For hours, then days, the community waited in the hallways and on the courthouse steps, their lives still on hold. The verdict, when it finally came, was a unanimous declaration of guilt on all counts, including first-degree murder and aggravated sexual assault. The jury had rejected the narrative of diminished responsibility, choosing instead to see the defendant's actions as a deliberate and calculated series of choices. The reading of the verdict was met with a heavy, collective exhale from the gallery, a moment of legal closure that provided a temporary reprieve from the weight of the investigation. The judge, in his final sentencing remarks, spoke to the specific nature of the crime, noting that the betrayal of a neighbor's trust was an aggravating factor that demanded the most severe penalty available under the law. He sentenced the man to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again walk the streets of a place like Leon. As the defendant was led away in handcuffs, he remained as impassive as he had been on the first day of the trial. He offered no apology, no explanation, and no sign of remorse. For the people of Leon, the The trial's end was not the beginning of a healing process, but the final confirmation of a permanent loss. The legal system had done its work, the evidence had been weighed, and the perpetrator had been removed from society, but the result of the trial could not restore the fundamental trust that had been the village's greatest asset. The verdict was a victory for the law, but it felt like a hollow one for a community that now knew exactly what kind of evil could live next door. The court records were filed away, and the lawyers moved on to other cases, but the transcripts of the Leon trial remained as a testament to a decade where a small village's peace was sacrificed at the altar of a neighbor's dark and silent impulses. The trial was over, but the psychological aftermath was just beginning to settle into the very earth of Leon. The final echoes of the gavel in the provincial courthouse did not bring the silence that Leon so desperately craved. Instead, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the beginning of a different, more permanent kind of quietude, a psychological winter that settled over the village and refused to lift. The aftermath of the Leon case is not merely a story of a prison sentence or a closed file. It is the story of how a single act of violence, committed by a familiar hand, can fundamentally rewrite the DNA of a community. To walk through Leon in the years following the trial was to witness a landscape in a state of perpetual mourning, not just for a lost child, but for the very concept of the neighbor. The physical village remained, but the social architecture that had supported it for generations had been completely dismantled. The most immediate and visible change was the death of the unlocked door. This simple, mundane habit, which had once been the pride of the village and the ultimate symbol of communal trust, vanished overnight. The clicking of locks and the sliding of bolts became the new soundtrack of the evening, a repetitive, metallic reminder that the person living 20 feet away was no longer assumed to be a friend. The psychological horror of the case was rooted in the proximity of the predator, and this proximity created a unique form of geographical trauma. The neighbor's house, once just another familiar structure in a row, became a cursed sight, a physical manifestation of the evil that had lived among them. For the families who remained on that street, every glance out of a window was a confrontation with the scene of the betrayal. They had to live with the knowledge that while they were weeping on their porches and calling out into the night, the architect of their misery was likely watching them from behind his own curtains, mere yards away. This reality created a pervasive sense of voyeuristic terror that lingered long after the man was behind bars. The village was forced to reckon with the fact that their most intimate moments of grief had been witnessed and perhaps even enjoyed by the killer. This realization poisoned the very soil of the neighborhood, making the act of simply existing in one's own home feel like an act of vulnerability. The comfort of the hearth was replaced by a restless, hypervigilant scanning of the perimeter. For the parents of the young girl, the aftermath was a journey through a landscape of impossible guilt and unanswerable questions. In a community like Leon, where everyone is a self-appointed guardian, the failure to protect a child is felt as a collective sin. The parents were trapped in a cycle of replaying that ordinary afternoon, searching for the moment they might have heard a sound or seen a shadow. But the show, don't tell, nature of the neighbor's crime meant there were no clues to find. The silence of the abduction became a haunting presence in their home, a void that could not be filled by the verdict of a court. They were forced to reconcile the image of the polite, quiet neighbor with the monster who had committed unspeakable acts in the Ram Rap forest. This cognitive dissonance is perhaps the most enduring scar of the Leon case. How does one continue to live in a world where the face of a friend can so easily mask the impulses of a predator? The trauma was not just the loss of their daughter, but the total destruction of their ability to trust their own perceptions of reality. The village of Leon became a microcosm for a broader societal shift that was occurring throughout the 1990s. It was the decade where the myth of rural innocence finally began to dissolve under the weight of high-profile tragedies that proved nowhere was truly safe. Leon, however, served as a particularly chilling example because the threat was internal. The case changed the way the community raised its children, ending the era of carefree, unobserved play. The green lawns and porches that had once been the vibrant center of childhood in Leon became quiet, empty spaces. Parents no longer watched from the kitchen window. They stood on the grass, their eyes never leaving their children. The forest at the edge of town, once a place of mystery and exploration, was permanently rebranded as a site of slaughter. The ram-wrapped vegetation was no longer seen as a beautiful natural border, but as a dark, unyielding shroud that had hidden a nightmare for 4 long days. The geography of Leon had been emotionally remapped, with safe zones shrinking and dangerous zones expanding until the entire village felt like a minefield of traumatic triggers. As the years passed, the story of Case Number 5 transitioned from news to legend, becoming a dark piece of local folklore that served as a warning to future generations. The names of the individuals involved might have faded from the daily conversation, but the lesson of the neighbor stayed at the forefront of the communal consciousness. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumed trust and the perils of ignoring the quiet ones who live on the margins. The psychological instability of the neighbor was analyzed and reanalyzed by locals, many of whom felt a lingering sense of responsibility for not having seen the signs earlier. This collective guilt manifested as a new, sharper edge to social interactions in Leon. The village became more closed, more suspicious of outsiders, and even more wary of its own members. The neighborly check-in was replaced by a guarded politeness, a social mask designed to maintain distance rather than bridge it. The warmth that had once defined the town was replaced by a sterile, cautious respect. Reflecting on the nature of the crime, one is struck by the sheer economy of the neighbor's evil. He did not need elaborate schemes or high-tech tools. He only needed the village's own goodness. He used the social contract of Leon against itself, turning the very qualities that made the town beautiful into the instruments of a child's destruction. This is the core of the psychological horror that Leon represents. It is the realization that our most cherished values, trust, community, familiarity, are the very things that can make us most vulnerable to the truly predatory. The neighbor did not just kill a child. He murdered a way of life. He proved that the monster does not have to break in. He is already there, invited to the barbecue, greeted on the sidewalk, and trusted with the most precious elements of our lives. The case of the Leon disappearance remains a cold, unyielding reminder that the boundaries of our safety are often much thinner than we dare to imagine. In the final analysis, the legacy of the 1990s in Leon is a legacy of broken silence. The silence of the abduction, the silence of the forest where the body was discovered, and the silence of the neighbor who watched the world burn from his front porch. This silence now resides in the very architecture of the village. It is in the high fences that have replaced the low bushes, the security cameras that now monitor the streets, and the way people avoid looking at the house that once belonged to the killer. The village has moved on in a chronological sense, but it remains frozen in that decade of trauma. The case remains a permanent part of the local identity, a dark thread woven into the history of every family that lived through it. They are a people who know a truth that most of us are fortunate enough to ignore, that the most terrifying thing in the universe is not the stranger in the dark, but the neighbor in the light. As we look back on the details of Case Number 5, we are forced to confront our own illusions of security. We like to believe that evil is an external force, something that announces itself with recognizable signs and arrives from distant, unfamiliar places. We want the monster to look like a monster. But Leon tells us a different story. It tells us that evil is often mundane, quiet, and deeply familiar. It tells us that the greatest tragedies occur not in the absence of community, but in the heart of it. The young girl playing on her lawn, the toys left in the grass, and the neighbor watching from next door. These are the images that define the Leon nightmare. They are images of a world that felt safe until the very moment it wasn't. And as the sun sets over the village today, casting long shadows toward that dark, ram-wrapped forest, the locks are turned and the bolts are slid into place, a nightly ritual of a community that finally understands the true cost of trust. The case is closed, the perpetrator is gone, but the lesson of Leon remains, whispered in the wind that ruffles the trees at the edge of town. The devil doesn't need an invitation when he already has a key to the neighborhood. This reflection serves as a final testament to the victim and the community she left behind. The goal of documenting such a tragedy is not to sensationalize the violence, but to honor the gravity of the loss and to acknowledge the profound way it changed the world. Leon is a different place now, a place defined by its scars, but it is also a place that possesses a hard-won clarity about the nature of the world. They have looked into the abyss, and the abyss was wearing the face of a neighbor. That is a burden no community should have to carry, yet it is the primary inheritance of Leon. As the story concludes, we are left with the image of the quiet streets and the locked doors, a silent tribute to a child who deserved a world as safe as her village promised her it was. The Nightmare of Leon is a permanent part of our collective criminal history, a story of psychological horror that continues to echo through the decades, reminding us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply look a little closer at the faces we think we know best. The profound legacy of a tragedy such as the one that decimated the spirit of Leon is rarely found in the physical evidence left behind or the dusty transcripts of a legal proceeding, but rather in the permanent, invisible restructuring of the collective human psyche that follows in its wake. As we move further away from the decade of the 1990s, the case of the missing girl and the neighbor who betrayed the very concept of community serves as more than just a historical footnote in criminal psychology. It has become a foundational pillar of the modern cautionary era. This final chapter of the Leon narrative is not about the arrest or the trial, which have long since been settled by the cold finality of the law, but about the enduring resonance of the silent predator and the way this specific case helped to define the cultural shift from a society of openness to one of pervasive, calculated suspicion. To look at Leon today is to see a village that has essentially become a monument to a lost world, a place where the physical geography remains largely unchanged, but where the emotional air is perpetually heavy with the knowledge of what occurred during that one golden afternoon when the silence was not a sign of peace, but a harbinger of total destruction. The historical significance of the Leon case lies primarily in its role as a catalyst for the death of the rural idol. For most of the 20th century, the rural village was marketed and perceived as the ultimate fortress of traditional values and safety, a landscape where the inherent goodness of one's neighbors acted as a natural repellent to the chaotic violence of the urban center. Leon was the quintessential example of this belief system. However, when the neighbor was revealed as the architect of such a profound and ritualistic cruelty, that entire ideological structure collapsed. The tragedy forced a realization that geographic isolation does not provide immunity from the darker impulses of the human condition. In fact, the case suggested something much more terrifying, that the very isolation and intimacy of a place like Leon could be weaponized by a predator to create a private, unobserved theater for violence. The neighbor did not succeed in spite of the community's closeness, but precisely because of it. He utilized the shared rhythms, the lack of surveillance, and the unearned trust of his peers to camouflage his movements, proving that the most effective hiding place for a monster is often right in the center of the crowd. This realization led to a fundamental shift in the way we perceive the neighbor archetype in the annals of true crime. Before the events in Leon, the figure of the neighbor in the collective imagination was almost always a benign presence, a source of borrowing sugar or watching the house while one was away. After the case of the girl in the woods, the neighbor became a figure of potential ambiguity, a person whose proximity is both a comfort and a risk. The psychological profile of the Leon perpetrator, a man who is described as quiet, unremarkable, and part of the scenery, became a standard for investigators and profilers seeking to understand how violent individuals can coexist with their victims without detection. This case helped to popularize the understanding that the most dangerous predators are often those who are most invested in the appearance of normalcy. They do not live on the fringes of society. They live in its heart, participating in its search parties and standing on its porches, all while harboring an internal reality that is entirely incompatible with the values of the community they inhabit. The long-term impact on child safety and parental behavior in the wake of the Leon case cannot be overstated. The transition from the free-range childhood of the late 20th century to the highly supervised, monitored experience of the 21st century finds one of its most tragic origin points in stories like the one from this small village. The parents of Leon, and by extension parents across the region who heard the story, were forced to confront the reality that a child is never truly home as long as there is an unsecured boundary between their yard and the world. The concept of the safe zone, was effectively abolished. This shift was not just about physical protection, but about the psychological burden of constant vigilance. The lightheartedness of a summer afternoon in a place like Lyon was replaced by a perpetual, underlying anxiety that has been passed down through generations. The children who grew up in the shadow of this case became the parents who today utilize GPS tracking and constant digital communication to ensure their own children never experience the terrifyingly easy disappearance that claimed the life of the girl in the 90s. Furthermore, the physical site of the crime itself, the dense Ram Wrap forest, has taken on a symbolic weight that transcends its actual geography. In the years following the trial, the woods became a place that was both feared and fetishized by the local imagination. While the residents of Lyon avoided the area where the body was found, the story of the nightmare at Lyon began to draw a different kind of attention from the outside world. It became a site of morbid curiosity, a location that served as a physical anchor for the burgeoning interest in true crime narratives. The woods, once a source of timber and a place for childhood adventure, became a landscape of trauma that people traveled to see, as if by standing among the trees they could somehow touch the darkness that had once resided there. This transformation of a tragedy into a piece of cultural lore is a common byproduct of such profound crimes, but in Lyon, it felt like a secondary violation. The village wanted to forget, but the world wanted to remember, and the forest stood as an unyielding witness to both desires. As for the family of the victim, their journey through the decades has been one of quiet, dignified endurance. They are the primary keepers of the memory of the girl who was taken, and their presence in the village remains a powerful, silent reminder of the cost of the neighbor's betrayal. They chose to stay in Lyon, a decision that many found difficult to understand, but one that was rooted in a desire to not let the perpetrator win by driving them from their home. Their house remains a sanctuary for their daughter's memory, a place where time has been allowed to stand still in a way that respects her life rather than her death. However, they also live with the permanent, unyielding presence of the what if. What if they had looked out the window 10 seconds earlier? What if they had been more suspicious of the man next door? These questions are the true psychological horror of the case, the mental traps that the predator laid for his victims long before he ever laid hands on the child. They are the fragments of the social contract that can never be fully repaired, even with the passage of 30 years. The perpetrator himself, now an aging figure in a high-security prison, has largely faded into the anonymity of the penal system. His life is a series of regulated hours and steel bars, a stark contrast to the freedom and trust he so ruthlessly exploited in Lyon. He remains a cipher, a man who offered a confession but never offered an apology, a person whose psychological instability remains a subject of study, but whose humanity remains a void. His removal from society was necessary for the law, but it could not remove the stain he left on the village. He is the ghost of Lyon, a presence that is felt every time a new resident moves into the town and asks about the history of the quiet house at the end of the block. He is the personification of the silent predator, the man who proved that the most terrifying thing in the world is not the monster under the bed, but the neighbor who helps you look for it. In concluding this deep dive into case number 5, we must acknowledge that The Nightmare at Lyon is ultimately a story about the limits of human understanding. We build communities, we establish rules, and we cultivate trust because these are the things that make life tenable. We operate on the assumption that the people around us are fundamentally like us, capable of empathy, bound by morality, and invested in the safety of the collective. The Lyon case was a violent refutation of that assumption. It showed us that it is possible to live in the closest proximity to another human being and have no true understanding of the darkness they are capable of harboring. It showed us that show, don't tell, is not just a technique for cinematic storytelling, but a terrifying principle of human behavior. The neighbor showed the village who he was through an act of unspeakable violence, and in doing so, he told them a truth about the world that they can never unlearn. The village of Lyon, as it stands today in the 26th year of the new millennium, is a place of beautiful but haunted stillness. The Ram Wrap woods still rustle in the evening breeze, and the houses still sit in their orderly rows under the watchful eye of the sun. But the innocence of the 90s is a distant, unreachable memory. The village is now a place where the doors are locked, the children are watched, and the neighbors are greeted with a careful, measured politeness that never quite reaches the eyes. The case of the girl and the neighbor has become the foundational myth of the town, a story that is told in whispers to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. It is a story that ends not with a sense of peace, but with a sense of permanent, unyielding vigilance. As the final words of this narrative are recorded, we are left with the image of a village that has learned to live with its ghosts, a community that knows that the price of its safety is the eternal loss of its trust. The nightmare at Lyon is over, but the silence it left behind will continue to echo for as long as there are neighbors living side by side in the fragile, beautiful, and dangerous light of the world. To conclude this exhaustive journey into the heart of the Lyon tragedy, we must look beyond the crime itself and examine the permanent, quiet erosion of the human spirit that occurs when the unthinkable becomes the historical reality of a home. In the 30 years that have passed since that dark decade of the 1990s, the village has undergone a physical and demographic evolution, but the psychological substrate remains unchanged. The true weight of case number 5 is not found in the number of years the perpetrator spent in a cell or the volume of the forensic reports, but in the specific way the people of Lyon now perceive the world and one another. This final meditation on the case is an exploration of the unseen consequences, the subtle, lingering vibrations of a trauma that refuses to dissipate. It is a study of the architecture of fear and the way a single, silent predator can permanently alter the frequency of communal life. When we talk about the end of innocence, we often speak in broad, societal terms, but in Lyon, the end of innocence was a tactile, local experience that can still be felt in the way the wind moves through the ram-wrap branches of the forest, and in the way a neighbor's gaze lingers just a second too long across a property line. The most profound and perhaps most disturbing element of the Lyon case remains the concept of the mask of sanity that the neighbor wore with such devastating competence. In true crime analysis, we often look for the cracks in the facade, the moments where the monster's true nature was revealed before the act. But in Lyon, the facade was the reality for everyone who encountered him. This is the enduring horror for the survivors, the realization that they were not deceived by a sophisticated lie, but by the sheer, overwhelming power of the mundane. The neighbor was not a brilliant manipulator in the cinematic sense. He was simply a man who existed within the expectations of his environment. He was quiet because rural life often produces quiet men. He was solitary because the village respected privacy. He was familiar because everyone was familiar. This realization forces a terrifying question upon us. If the most horrific acts of violence can be committed by those who fit perfectly into our social landscape, then the very concept of knowing someone is revealed to be a fragile, perhaps even dangerous, illusion. The people of Lyon did not fail to see him. They saw exactly what he wanted them to see, and that is a betrayal that no amount of time or justice can ever fully rectify. The geography of Lyon has become a map of trauma, where every landmark is tethered to a specific moment of the tragedy. The forest, which has grown even more ram-wrap and impenetrable over the last 3 decades, stands as a silent monument to the 4 days of desperation. To the outsider, it is merely a beautiful, dark expanse of nature, but to the resident, it is a site of desecration. The path to the discovery is no longer a physical trail, but a mental one that many are forced to walk every time they see the tree line from their bedroom windows. This geography of trauma extends to the residential streets themselves. The house where the neighbor lived, though long since sold and remodeled, remains a void in the social fabric of the village. It is a structure that is lived in but never truly occupied by the community's spirit. The current residents, however disconnected they may be from the events of the 90s, are the unwitting custodians of a crime scene. They live in the space where a man sat and watched a child play on a lawn, where he meticulously planned a disappearance that would shatter a world. This proximity to evil, even decades removed, creates a lingering atmospheric pressure that defines the experience of living in Lyon. Furthermore, we must consider the secondary victims of the Lyon case, the searchers, the investigators, and the neighbors who participated in the collective trauma. These are the individuals who carry the sensory details of the discovery in their minds, details that were never fully captured in the courtroom transcripts. The smell of the ram-wrapped forest undergrowth, the specific quality of the light as the flashlights hit the remains, and the sound of the parents' voices as the news was delivered are all sensory ghosts that haunt the older generation of the village. For many of these people, the tragedy did not end with the verdict. It simply moved indoors, becoming a private, silent struggle with the memory of what they saw and what they failed to prevent. This collective post-traumatic stress is the silent engine of the village's current culture of vigilance. The hypervigilance of Leon is not a choice, but a survival mechanism, a way to manage the overwhelming realization that their world is far more fragile than they ever dared to believe. The case also serves as a profound meditation on the nature of trust versus the necessity of safety. In the years following the trial, the village of Leon effectively redefined the social contract. The old contract was based on the assumption of shared morality. The new one is based on the management of risk. This shift represents a fundamental loss of human connectivity. When you lock your door not against a stranger, but against the possibility of a neighbor, you are sacrificing a piece of your own humanity at the altar of security. The people of Leon are safer now than they were in the early 90s, but they are also more isolated. The communal life that once defined the village has been replaced by a series of fortified, private experiences. The children of Leon today are protected by a wall of surveillance and parental anxiety that ensures they will never be taken from a lawn, but they are also growing up in a world where the man next door is a potential threat rather than a source of community. This is the true cost of case number 5, a permanent tax on the social trust that makes a community a home. In the final analysis, the neighbor who committed the crime achieved a dark kind of immortality. By luring a child into the woods and committing an act of unspeakable violence, he did more than take a life. He inserted himself into the very identity of the village. He became a permanent inhabitant of their collective memory, a ghost that cannot be exorcised by a life sentence. Every time a parent in Leon tells their child to stay within sight of the house, every time a lock is turned at sunset, and every time a neighbor is viewed with a fleeting moment of suspicion, the perpetrator is still there, exercising his power over the community. He destroyed the peace of Leon not just for a decade, but for the foreseeable future. The psychological horror of the case is its endurance. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten because the wounds it inflicted are so deep they have become part of the town's foundation. The silence of Leon is no longer the silence of peace. It is the silence of a community that is still holding its breath, waiting for a danger they now know can arrive at any moment, from any direction, and with any familiar face. As we close this narrative, we are left with a lingering reflection on the responsibility of the witness. By examining the details of the Leon case, we are not just consuming a story of crime and punishment. We are observing the collapse of a human ideal. The story of the girl in the woods and the neighbor on the porch is a story about the fragility of the structures we build to keep the darkness at bay. It is a reminder that the world is often as dangerous as it is beautiful, and that our greatest vulnerabilities are often our greatest virtues. Our capacity to trust, our desire for community, and our belief in the goodness of those around us. The village of Leon stands as a testament to the fact that while justice can be served, it can never restore what was truly lost. The girl is gone, the neighbor is in prison, and the village is safe, but the spirit of Leon remains in a state of permanent mourning. The lessons of Leon are cold and uncompromising. They tell us that proximity is not intimacy, that familiarity is not safety, and that the most terrifying predators are those who understand the rhythms of our lives better than we do. As the sun sets once again over the ram-wrapped forest that borders the village, the long shadows stretch toward the homes that have seen too much and forgotten too little. The light fades, the doors are locked, and the village settles into the heavy, vigilant quiet that has defined it for 30 years. It is a silence that speaks of a loss that can never be measured and a trauma that can never be fully healed. The Leon case is a story that ends not with a resolution, but with a warning that the most dangerous distance in the world is the few feet of grass between your front door and your neighbors, and that the monster you fear is often the one you've already invited in. In this 8th and final part of our exploration, We acknowledge that some stories do not have a conclusion that provides comfort. Some stories are meant to sit with us, to trouble our sense of security, and to force us to look at the world with a more discerning, perhaps more sorrowful, eye. The Girl of Leon remains a symbol of a childhood that was stolen not just by a man, but by a community's own beautiful, tragic naivety. And the Village of Leon remains a symbol of the high price we pay for the knowledge of evil. The files are shelved, the recording is finished, and the narrative is complete, but the silence of Leon will continue to vibrate in the minds of all who have walked through its dark, ram-rap history. It is a silence that demands we remember, a silence that demands we watch, and a silence that tells us, with devastating clarity, that the world changed forever on a quiet afternoon in the 1990s, and it will never be the same again. As we step away from this case, we leave the village to its vigil. We leave the parents to their memory, and we leave the woods to their secrets. The story of Leon is a profound, echoing reminder of the dark potential that resides within the mundane. It is the definitive case number 5, a narrative of psychological horror that has no equal, and a warning that will remain relevant as long as there are people who believe that they are safe simply because they are home. The lights in Leon go out one by one, but the eyes of the village remain open, watching the dark, watching the neighbors, and waiting for a dawn that will never truly be as bright as the ones they remember from before the nightmare began. The end of this story is not a period, but a lingering question, a cold whisper in the ear of every listener that says, "Do you truly know the person living next to you?" And in the silence that follows, the answer from Leon is a soft, devastating, and permanent no. The persistent nature of a tragedy like the one that occurred in Leon is that it does not eventually dissipate into the atmosphere like a passing storm. Instead, it becomes a permanent part of the local geography, a silent layer of history that settles over the stones and the trees. As we reach this final stage of our examination into case number 5, we must look at the lingering shadows that continue to stretch across the village long after the original actors have left the stage. The passage of 3.5 decades has not served to erase the psychological horror of the event, but has rather petrified it into a cautionary landmark for the entire region. To understand the full scope of the aftermath, one must look at the way the village exists today, in the late spring of 26, where the echoes of the 90s still vibrate in the air during those quiet, golden afternoons. The story of the missing girl and the neighbor who lived in the light remains a living document, a narrative that refuses to be relegated to the dusty archives of the provincial police because its central thesis remains as terrifyingly relevant as it was the day the first search party entered the Ram-Rap forest. One of the most profound and least discussed elements of the Leon case is the professional trauma experienced by the first responders and the forensic specialists who were tasked with documenting the scene in the woods. These individuals were trained to handle violence, to catalog the remnants of human cruelty with a clinical and detached eye, yet the discovery in the Leon forest challenged their psychological defenses in a way they had never anticipated. The condition of the child's body, described in the official records as not intact, created a sensory memory that many of those officers carried into their retirement. The sheer contrast between the peaceful, domestic setting of the village and the savage, ritualistic nature of the crime scene deep in the thickets was too great a gap for the human mind to easily bridge. These men and women did not just see a crime, they saw the total collapse of the moral order they were sworn to protect. For years afterward, many of the original investigators found themselves unable to walk through similar rural landscapes without feeling a visceral sense of dread, a phantom weight that reminded them of the day they discovered that the most familiar faces could harbor the most alien impulses. The physical house where the neighbor lived has become a psychological void in the center of Leon, a structure that the village has tried to aesthetically erase but can never truly forget. Even after multiple renovations and changes in ownership, the property remains a focal point for the communal memory. The neighbors who moved in later, those who had no direct connection to the events of the 90s, often speak of a peculiar atmospheric pressure that exists on that specific lot. It is not a haunting in the supernatural sense, but rather a haunting of the collective conscience. The village knows that within those walls, a man once sat and watched the world through a window of calculated malice. They know that he existed in the same domestic space as they did, performing the same mundane rituals of eating and sleeping, all while harboring a predatory intent that defies comprehension. The house stands as a permanent reminder that evil does not require a lair or a dungeon. It can flourish in a suburban kitchen or a standard living room, blending seamlessly into the background of a quiet life. This leads us to the intergenerational impact of the Leone case, a phenomenon where the trauma of the parents has been transmitted to a generation of children who were not yet born when the crime occurred. The youth of Leone today grow up with an inherent understanding of the world's fragility that is absent in other nearby towns. They are the heirs to a culture of vigilance that was forged in the fires of Case Number 5. In Leone, the standard warnings about safety are not abstract or hypothetical. They are grounded in the specific, tangible history of their own streets. The parents who lived through the disappearance do not just tell their children to be careful. They watch them with an intensity that reflects a deep-seated fear of history repeating itself. This has created a unique social dynamic in the village, where the younger generation is simultaneously more protected and more aware of the darkness that can exist behind a friendly smile. The Leone effect is a state of being where the community is defined by its scars, a place where the collective memory acts as a permanent, invisible shield that both protects and isolates. The Ram Rap forest itself has undergone a symbolic transformation over the decades, moving from a place of nature to a landscape of profound psychological horror. To the casual traveler, the woods that border Leone are a beautiful example of the region's natural heritage, but to the local, the trees are silent witnesses to an act of unspeakable depravity. The specific site of the discovery has never been officially marked, yet its location is known to almost every long-term resident. It is a place that the village has collectively decided to leave to the silence. The vegetation has grown thicker and more tangled, as if the earth itself is trying to bury the secret deeper within the soil. Yet, during the autumn months when the leaves fall and the light penetrates deeper into the thickets, the village is reminded that the past is never truly gone. The forest remains a physical boundary between the known and the unknown, a place where the safety of the village ends and the chaotic reality of the predator begins. It serves as a perpetual reminder that the peace of Leone is a fragile construction, maintained only by the constant, exhausting effort of the community. The neighbor's mask of sanity, a term often used in the study of sociopathic behavior, was so perfectly executed in the Leone case that it remains a subject of intense analysis for modern psychologists. The man did not just hide his impulses. He integrated them into a persona that was so banal, it was effectively invisible. This is the detail that the village finds the most difficult to forgive. They are not just angry at the man for the murder. They are haunted by the fact that they allowed him to be part of their lives. They are haunted by the conversations they had with him, the waves they exchanged across fences, and the polite smiles they offered a monster. This sense of collective failure is the engine that drives the village's current obsession with surveillance and security. They are trying to make up for the one time they failed to see the truth. They are attempting to build a world where a neighbor can never again be a stranger, yet in doing so, they have discovered that total transparency is an impossible goal. The human heart remains a private, impenetrable territory, and the lesson of Leone is that we can never truly know what resides within it. As we conclude this narrative, we must reflect on the role of the story itself in the healing or harming of the community. Case Number 5 has been told and retold in whispers and headlines, in legal briefs and true crime podcasts, until it has become a mythic struggle between the light of the village and the darkness of the woods. For the people of Leone, the telling of the story is an act of both remembrance and exorcism. By speaking the truth of what happened, they are attempting to strip the perpetrator of his power and to reclaim the narrative of their town. Yet, the story also serves to keep the trauma alive, ensuring that the wound never fully closes. It is a delicate balance between honoring the victim and refusing to let the perpetrator's shadow define the future. The young girl who was lost in the 90s remains the central figure of this myth, a symbol of the innocence that the village is still trying to protect, 35 years after she vanished from her front yard. The final legacy of Leone is the understanding that safety is not a destination, but a continuous process of awareness. The village has learned the hard way that the most dangerous threats are not those that come from the outside, but those that grow within the fertile soil of trust and familiarity. Case number 5 is a permanent fixture of our collective understanding of crime because it challenges our most basic assumptions about the sanctity of our homes. It forces us to acknowledge that the person living next door, the person we trust to watch our children and our houses, could be a vessel for a violence that defies logic. The nightmare at Lyon did not end with the verdict or the prison sentence. It continues every time a door is locked and every time a parent looks toward the Ram Rap woods with a sense of unease. It is a story of psychological horror that has no true ending, only a series of long, echoing ripples that will continue to move through the village for as long as there are people left to remember the afternoon when the music of a child's laughter was replaced by a silence that has never truly gone away. As the sun sets over the provincial landscape today, the village of Lyon prepares for the night with a ritualistic precision that has become second nature. The streetlights flicker to life, casting long, stark shadows across the meticulously kept lawns. The families retreat into their homes, the sound of locks and bolts providing a rhythmic confirmation of their commitment to security. Out at the edge of town, the forest stands dark and indifferent, its Ram Rap canopy hiding the secrets of the past. The village is quiet, but it is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of a community that is still on guard. They are a people who have seen the face of the neighbor, and they know that the world is a place where the light can be a mask and the darkness can be a home. The story of Lyon is finished, the record is complete, and the final word has been spoken. But in the heart of the village, the memory remains, a cold and unyielding sentinel that watches the horizon, waiting for a dawn that will never again be as simple as the ones that came before the 90s. Case number 5 is closed, but the nightmare of Lyon is eternal, a permanent part of the human story that warns us all to look a little closer at the shadows on our own porches. The finality of a case like the one that occurred in Lyon is not measured by the closing of a prison door or the final signature on a legal document, but by the slow, agonizing process of a community attempting to reclaim its soul from the wreckage of a shattered trust. As we stand in the year 26, looking back across the decades to that pivotal moment in the 1990s, we are forced to recognize that the aftermath is not a period of time with a definite end, but a permanent state of being for the village. The physical village of Lyon has, in many ways, evolved with the rest of the world. The narrow lanes have been paved, the old wooden fences have been replaced by more modern, secure barriers, and the sound of digital life now permeates the air, where once only the wind and the rustle of the Ram Rap forest could be heard. Yet, beneath this veneer of modern progress, the foundational trauma of case number 5 remains the defining characteristic of the local identity. The story of the girl who vanished from her own front yard and the neighbor who watched the world burn from his porch has become the bedrock of Lyon's collective consciousness, a narrative that is whispered into the foundations of every new home built within its borders. The enduring psychological horror of this case is rooted in the realization that the most profound evil does not require a dramatic entrance or a recognizable silhouette. It thrives in the spaces we consider most safe, utilizing the very mechanisms of our social cohesion to find its prey. The neighbor was the ultimate manifestation of this reality. He was not a monster who came from the outside to disrupt the peace of Lyon. He was a product of that peace, a man whose predatory nature was nourished by the very insulation and trust that the village worked so hard to maintain. This paradox is what haunts the residents of Lyon to this day. They're forced to live with the knowledge that their community did not just harbor a killer, but provided him with the perfect environment in which to operate. The village's commitment to privacy, its respect for the quiet man, and its refusal to imagine the unthinkable were the very tools the perpetrator used to execute his crime. This realization has led to a permanent, systemic shift in how the people of Lyon interact with one another, a transition from a culture of assumed goodness to a culture of perpetual, internalized surveillance. To walk through the residential heart of Lyon today is to see the physical manifestations of this shift. The architectural openness of the 90s is gone, replaced by a visual language of exclusion and defense. The front porches, which were once the social centers of the village, are now often empty, their primary function shifted from engagement to observation. The locks on the doors are more sophisticated, the security cameras are more numerous, and the boundaries between properties are marked with a new, aggressive clarity. This is the Leone tax on trust, a psychological cost that every resident pays for the privilege of living in a place with such a dark history. The new families who move to the village, attracted by its scenic beauty and its reputation for quiet, are quickly initiated into this culture of vigilance. They learn the story of case number 5 not from the news, but from the guarded behavior of their neighbors and the way the older generation looks toward the forest with a sense of unyielding unease. The village has become a living museum of the moment that rural innocence died, a place where the past is always present in the way a shadow falls across a lawn. The neighbor himself, though he has spent the last 30 years in a state-sanctioned exile, remains the most powerful figure in the village's imagination. He is the standard against which all future threats are measured, the boogeyman who proved that the greatest danger is often the one we've already invited in for coffee. His mask of sanity was so complete that it has created a permanent suspicion of the ordinary. In Leone, being quiet or different is no longer seen as a benign personality trait. It is seen as a potential warning sign. This is perhaps the cruelest legacy of his crime. He has made it impossible for the community to ever truly relax in the presence of the mundane. The people of Leone are constantly looking for the tell, the small crack in the facade that might indicate a hidden darkness, yet they know from their own history that the most successful predators don't have any cracks at all. This creates a state of perpetual psychological tension, a hypervigilant peace where the absence of conflict is not a sign of safety, but merely a sign that the threat has not yet revealed itself. The ram-wrap forest that looms at the edge of the village has become the spiritual anchor of this trauma. It is a landscape that has been emotionally remapped, transformed from a place of natural beauty into a cathedral of memory and loss. The trees that stand there today were witnesses to the search, the discovery, and the ultimate shattering of the village's spirit. For the survivors of the 90s, the forest is a place where the light never quite reaches the ground, where the air is always heavy with the weight of what was found in the underbrush. They see the woods not as a part of the environment, but as a silent, unyielding witness that refuses to let the past go. The forest is the physical boundary of their world, a reminder that just beyond the edges of their controlled, secure lives lies a vast, indifferent wilderness where the rules of civilization do not apply. It is the place where the silence of the abduction was finally broken by the reality of the discovery, and for the people of Leone, that break is permanent. The legacy of the victim, the young girl whose life was extinguished in the woods, has transcended the specifics of her biography to become a universal symbol of the vulnerability of innocence. She is the girl on the lawn, the child with the toys, the spirit of a world that believed it was safe. Her name is spoken with a reverent, sorrowful tone in the village, a reminder of the price that was paid for their current state of awareness. She is the reason the doors are locked, the reason the cameras are watching, and the reason the community remains so fiercely protective of its own. Her tragedy has become the moral compass of the village, a story that is told to ensure that the next generation understands the true nature of the world they inhabit. In Leone, the memory of the girl is not just a source of grief, but a source of power, a collective vow that such a silence will never be allowed to fall over their streets again. They have turned their trauma into a shield, using the darkness of the past to light the way toward a future where vigilance is the only true form of sanctuary. As we conclude this 10-part exploration of case number 5, we are forced to confront the reality that some tragedies are simply too profound for a traditional resolution. The legal system did what it was designed to do. It identified the perpetrator, presented the evidence, and removed the threat from society. But the legal system cannot repair a broken social contract, and it cannot restore the trust that was the very foundation of the village. The Nightmare at Leone is a story with a conviction but no closure. It is a narrative that remains open, vibrating in the minds of the people who lived through it and the people who have inherited its consequences. It serves as a stark, unyielding reminder that the human capacity for evil is not limited by geography, proximity, or familiarity. It tells us that the most terrifying things in our lives do not always come from the shadows. Sometimes they are the shadows, hiding in plain sight in the middle of a sunlit afternoon. The village of Lyon will continue to exist, to grow, and to change as the 26th year of the century moves forward. New houses will be built, new children will play on the lawns, and the Ram Rap Forest will continue its slow, indifferent growth. But the village will always be the place of case number 5. It will always be the site where a neighbor proved that the ultimate betrayal is the one committed with a smile. The silence of the 90s has been replaced by the noise of the modern world, but for those who know how to listen, the old quiet is still there, resting in the spaces between the houses and in the deep, dark heart of the woods. It is a silence that speaks of a loss that can never be recovered and a trauma that has become a permanent part of the earth. The story of Lyon is a story of psychological horror that has no true end, only a series of long, echoing ripples that will continue to move through the community for as long as there are people left to remember. In our final look at the village, as the sun sets over the provincial landscape and the long shadows of the trees stretch toward the quiet homes, we see a community that has learned to live with its ghosts. They are a people who have looked into the abyss and seen a familiar face looking back. They have survived the unthinkable, but they have been changed by it in ways that defy simple description. They are safe, they are secure, and they're vigilant. But they're also a people who know that the world is a place where the light can be a mask and the neighbor can be a monster. And as the lights of Lyon go out one by one, and the final locks are turned for the night, the village settles into a silence that is no longer a sign of peace, but a sign of a community that is still, 35 years later, holding its breath. The case is finished, the record is complete, and the final word has been spoken. But the nightmare of Lyon is eternal, a permanent part of the human story that warns us all to look a little closer at the shadows on our own porches and to never, ever mistake familiarity for safety. Case number 5 is closed, but the lesson of the neighbor will remain as long as there are people who believe that they are safe simply because they are home. The culmination of a long-form investigation into case number 5 must eventually grapple with the concept of historical haunting, the way a specific geographic point on a map becomes permanently saturated with the resonance of a singular, horrific event. As we look at Lyon in the present day, we are not just looking at a collection of houses and streets. We are looking at a living archive of a psychological siege that began in the 1990s and never truly concluded. The village has become a case study in the longevity of communal trauma, a place where the show, don't tell, nature of the neighbor's crime has dictated the social script for over 3 decades. This final movement of our narrative is an exploration of the permanence of the scar. It is a study of how a community, having been forced to witness the absolute limit of human depravity in its own backyard, attempts to construct a future while being perpetually anchored to a moment of total systemic failure. The story of the girl in the woods and the man next door is no longer just a crime. It is the atmospheric pressure that defines the very act of breathing in Lyon. The most disturbing legacy of the Lyon incident is the way it has corrupted the sensory experience of the rural landscape. In the years before the disappearance, the sights and sounds of the village were interpreted through a lens of inherent benevolence. The sound of a car slowing down on a gravel road was simply a neighbor returning home. The sight of a figure standing at the edge of a field was merely a farmer checking his crops. After the revelation of the neighbor's true nature, these same sensory inputs were recategorized as potential threats. The village entered a state of sensory hypervigilance that has persisted through generations. This is the psychological horror of the aftermath, the inability to ever again experience the environment as neutral. To a resident of Lyon, the Ram Rap Forest is not just a collection of trees. It is a dark, heavy weight on the horizon that represents the 4 days when the world was upside down. The forest does not just exist, it looms. It acts as a physical manifestation of the repressed memory of the village, a place where the sunlight struggles to reach the ground and where the silence is always a little too thick. This sensory corruption extends to the way the people of Lyon perceive human behavior. The neighbor's ability to mimic normalcy while harboring such extreme instability has created a local culture of microscrutiny. Residents have become unintentional profilers, subconsciously scanning the actions of their peers for the slightest hint of a hidden motive. A neighbor who is too friendly is viewed with the same suspicion as one who is too distant. This is the tragic irony of the Leone legacy. In an attempt to protect themselves from another silent predator, the community has sacrificed the very ease of interaction that made the village desirable in the first place. They have replaced the unlocked door with a locked mind, a psychological barrier that ensures no one can ever truly get close enough to cause harm, but also ensures that no one can ever truly be known. The social fabric of Leone is now a series of parallel lives that intersect only at the level of guarded necessity. The warmth of the 90s has been replaced by a clinical, defensive politeness that acts as a permanent social armor. The perpetrator, though long removed from the physical streets of the village, remains the most influential architect of the current communal reality. Every security measure, every parental warning, and every suspicious glance is a tribute to the power of his betrayal. He achieved a form of negative immortality, ensuring that his name, or at least the memory of his act, would be spoken in hushed tones as long as the village stands. He successfully broke the peace of Leone, and in doing so, he created a permanent demand for the very thing he destroyed: safety. The village's obsession with surveillance is a direct response to his invisibility. They're trying to build a world where nothing can happen without being recorded, a world where the silence of the abduction can be replayed and analyzed until it yields a truth. Yet, the people of Leone know, deep in their collective soul, that cameras cannot record intent. They know that the most dangerous impulses do not always leave a trail on a digital drive. They are chasing a level of security that their own history has proven to be an illusion. The intergenerational transmission of this trauma has created a unique demographic in Leone, a generation of young adults who have inherited a fear they never personally experienced. These heirs of the 90s carry the weight of case number 5 in the way they navigate their own domestic spaces. They are the most vigilant generation the village has ever produced, a group of people for whom the concept of neighborly trust is a historical curiosity rather than a lived reality. They have been raised on the story of the girl who went to play and never came back, and they have been taught that the woods are a place of secrets rather than adventure. This generational anxiety has created a feedback loop that reinforces the village's isolation. The world outside Leone is seen as chaotic and dangerous, but the world inside Leone is seen as a fragile sanctuary that must be defended at all costs. The tragedy of the past has become the primary filter through which the future is viewed, ensuring that the nightmare at Leone remains a living, breathing part of the community's identity. Reflecting on the role of the victim in this enduring narrative, we see that the girl has become a secular saint of the village, a symbol of the innocence that was sacrificed so that the community could finally see the truth. Her image, the young child playing on the lawn, is the before to the village's after. She represents the period of history where the doors were unlocked and the neighbors were friends. In Leone, remembering her is an act of resistance against the man who tried to erase her. But it is also a source of permanent sorrow, a reminder that the village's current state of safety was purchased with her life. The community's vigilance is a form of penance for the collective failure of the 90s. They watch the children of today with a desperate intensity because they know, with a devastating clarity, what happens when the watch is relaxed. The girl of Leone is not just a name in a file. She is the moral weight that keeps the village anchored to its duty. The forest itself, which has grown even more ram-rap and impenetrable in the 3 decades since the crime, serves as the final, silent character in the story. It is the place where the village ends and the horror begins. The woods have claimed the site of the discovery, burying it under years of leaf litter and new growth, but they have not released the memory. During the quiet hours of the late afternoon, when the light hits the trees at that specific 90s angle, the village is reminded of the 4 days of the search. They are reminded of the flashlights, the shouting, and the eventual, crushing silence of the discovery. The forest remains an unyielding witness to the fact that evil is a part of the natural landscape, a presence that can be managed but never fully removed. It is a reminder that the peace of Leone is a thin, human construction built over an abyss of incomprehensible impulses. In this 11th and final chapter of our script, we must accept that some narratives do not offer the comfort of an ending. The Case of the Neighbor and the Child in Lyon is a story of psychological horror that has transformed into a way of life. The village has moved forward, but it has not moved on. It is a community that has learned to live in the shadow of its own history, a place where the locks are turned with a specific, heavy intention, and where the neighbors are greeted with a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. The tragedy of case number 5 is that it proved that the world is a place where the unthinkable can happen in the most ordinary of settings. It proved that the person living next door is a mystery that can never be fully solved. And as the sun sets over Lyon today, casting its long, distorted shadows toward the Ram Rap Woods, the village settles into the same vigilant quiet that has defined it since the 90s. The lights go out, the doors are bolted, and the community waits for the morning, always aware that the darkness is not just in the forest, but in the heart of the man next door. The narrative arc of Lyon is a circle that always returns to the lawn and the neighbor. It is a story of a betrayal so deep that it has become a part of the earth. As we finish this exhaustive documentation, we leave the village to its eternal watch. We leave the Ram Rap forest to its secrets, and we leave the people of Lyon to the quiet, heavy duty of remembering. The case is finished, the investigation is archived, and the script is complete. But the nightmare at Lyon will continue to vibrate in the silence of every locked door and in the guarded gaze of every neighbor. It is a story that warns us that the most dangerous distance in the world is the few feet of grass between us and the person we think we know. And in the final, suffocating quiet of the village, that warning remains the only truth that truly matters. The end of case number 5 is not a period, but a permanent, haunting question that every resident of Lyon must answer every time they look across the fence. Who is the monster in the light? The silence of the village is the only answer that remains, a silence that has been held since the 90s and will never, ever be broken again.